Hello everyone, I am Alex and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember the exact moment I first laid eyes on that abandoned hotel. The night air was strangely still, and even though there was no wind, I felt an inexplicable chill sweeping across my arms. The building stood against a backdrop of flickering street lamps and the distant rattle of cargo trains. Its looming silhouette and shattered windows turned my stomach in an unsettling way. I had come here to capture photographs of its decaying grandeur, a personal project fueled by curiosity and a fascination for abandoned architecture. But from the moment I stepped onto that deserted side street, I sensed something was wrong. The darkness felt heavier than it should have, almost suffocating. It was as if the shadows along the walls reached out for me when I passed by. I'm not usually one to jump at every creak in the dark, but that night my heart was pounding before I even set foot inside the hotel. I had parked my car a block away, near the skeletal remains of a loading dock for freight trains. The place was lifeless after 8 o'clock in the evening. I didn't see a single pedestrian or any sign of another soul. With my camera bag slung over my shoulder, I walked down a dimly lit road until I reached a rusted fence. A dull lamp overhead sputtered weakly, buzzing like an irritated insect. I looked for an entrance but realized I'd have to climb the fence. My palms were slick with sweat as I hoisted myself over the top. It struck me as odd that a place so dilapidated was still behind a barrier of any kind, almost like someone wanted to keep people out or lock something in. Once I landed on the other side, I glimpsed the silhouette of the old hotel, 3 stories high, with boarded-up windows on the lower floors and a few broken ones up top. Even from the outside, it radiated a sense of urgency, as though it demanded attention or warned me away. I tried to brush off the apprehension gnawing at me. I was there to take pictures, I reminded myself, not to play ghost hunter. Still, I found my heart beating faster than usual, and my mouth felt dry as I approached the weathered front doors. To my surprise, they gave way with a gentle push, creaking open on rusted hinges that let out a low groan. The reception area was shrouded in dust so thick it clung to every surface like a fine gray carpet. My flashlight beam revealed old armchairs, their upholstery torn and covered in grime. A toppled lamp lay on the floor, its shade cracked. The reception desk, once presumably tidy and welcoming, was in disarray, as if someone had frantically swept away its contents. Papers and small objects lay scattered across the counter, and I caught a glimpse of a leather-bound ledger splayed open near the edge. I felt an unexpected pang in my gut. It looked like whoever was here last had left in a hurry. I shone my flashlight around, trying to maintain my composure. Each step kicked up little clouds of dust that made me cough, and my skin felt prickly from the sudden temperature drop inside. My nose twitched at a stale odor I couldn't quite place, like mold mixed with something chemical, maybe oil or old cleaning supplies that had gone rancid. The walls were peeling, exposing layers of faded wallpaper and rotting plaster. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and uneven, echoing in the hollow space. I wanted to photograph the lobby first, documenting the grandeur that once was. Carefully, I extracted my camera from the bag and turned it on. The electronic beep sounded absurdly loud in the stillness. My hands trembled slightly as I set up the shot. I snapped a few pictures of the dusty armchairs and the overturned desk, noticing a stale chill brushing my neck. It felt like I was being watched, but I dismissed it as nerves. The lens captured details I hadn't noticed with my naked eye, footprints in the thick dust behind the reception desk. Faint, but definitely human. They led off into the gloom on the far side of the lobby where a corridor branched out. I felt queasiness in the pit of my stomach. Someone else had been there, and maybe not too long ago. The corridor leading to the guest rooms was lined with heavy wooden doors. My flashlight revealed tarnished brass numbers on each, but every single door I tried was locked. I ran my fingers over the doorknobs and found them encrusted with grime. Dust motes swirled around me in the stale air. My pulse quickened and my throat felt tight. The entire place seemed unnervingly frozen in time, as if the occupants had simply vanished one day and never returned. At the end of the hallway, I discovered a side corridor that led to a service stairwell. The door to the stairwell was cracked open. Faded paint spelled out staff only in letters so worn, they barely stood out. I nudged the door with my shoulder, and it let out a long, high-pitched squeal. With each step, the metal stairs groaned beneath my feet. The smell of old oil grew stronger. The overhead lighting fixtures were coated in grime, some dangling precariously by their wires. My flashlight's beam caught swirling dust particles that glimmered eerily, reminding me of fireflies trapped in a tomb. As I climbed higher, the temperature seemed to drop another few degrees. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and my breaths grew ragged. The building felt heavier the farther I went, as though the weight of the upper floors pressed down on me. By the time I reached the top floor, I was shaking so much that I had to pause on the landing to steady myself. The silence pressed in from all sides, broken only by the echo of my steps and the hum of distant trains outside. The chemical stench was almost overpowering, burning the back of my throat. I found myself in a narrow corridor. The doors along this stretch were all open. Each room was stripped bare. No furniture, no decorations, no signs of habitation, just walls marred by cracks and a few scattered debris on the floor. But there was one room at the very end, its door ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me. I felt a surge of dread that seemed to center in my chest, making my heart pound so violently I could hardly breathe. Yet a perverse curiosity pushed me forward. I approached with my flashlight raised, every nerve in my body on high alert. That was when I heard it, a gentle rustling noise, like plastic shifting. It came from inside the room. The sound was unmistakable, a soft crackle that made every hair on my neck stand on end. My mouth went so dry I could barely swallow. I paused in the doorway, shining my light inside. What I saw made my stomach twist. Large black garbage bags stacked in a corner, their surfaces glinting under the flashlight's glare. They looked recently placed because the dust around them was disturbed, forming odd patterns on the floor. I couldn't tell what was inside, but the sight of them made me uneasy. The rustling continued even though I could see no movement. Part of me wanted to call out to ask if someone was there, but I was paralyzed by a sense of imminent danger. My heart hammered against my ribcage so fiercely that I thought it might give me away, as if whoever or whatever was there could hear it throbbing in my chest. I watched, straining my eyes, but couldn't see anything that should be causing the plastic to shift. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, and my vision narrowed. The chemical smell was thicker in that room, almost nauseating. My hands were slick with sweat as I forced myself to snap a few hasty photos, though I wasn't even sure what I was capturing. I felt an overwhelming sensation that I wasn't alone. The corners of the room, lost in shadow, seemed to pulse with the possibility of a hidden figure. My mind raced through dreadful scenarios, a stranger lurking in the dark, some unnatural presence watching my every move. It was so intense that I could hardly stand there. My stomach churned, and I tasted bitter adrenaline at the back of my tongue. Every instinct told me to leave, immediately. I hesitated only because a sick, morbid fascination rooted me to the floor. I almost whispered a question into the dark, but no words emerged. Fear pinned them to the back of my throat. Then I heard something, a faint shuffle, as if a foot had slid across the dirty floor. It was distant yet unmistakable. That small sound cut through me like a razor. My entire body turned cold, and I gasped sharply, the flashlight trembling in my hand. For a moment I thought I glimpsed a shape shifting in the corner of my eye. I whipped around with my light, but there was no one there. My rational mind tried to reassure me that I might have imagined it, but everything felt too immediate, too real. I decided I had seen enough. I backed out of the room, stepping into the corridor with trembling legs. My lungs felt tight, and each breath was a labored gasp. The moment my feet crossed that threshold, I sensed movement in the darkness behind me. It was subtle, like someone gliding across the floor just out of sight, but it made my skin crawl. Panic surged, and my body switched into survival mode. My mouth was dry, my heart was hammering, and I had an overwhelming urge to flee. Without a second glance, I turned and ran toward the stairwell. Descending those narrow metal steps felt like a nightmare. The clang of my shoes against the iron rang through the stale air, but I could also hear another set of steps, lighter but in sync with mine. My chest burned as I raced down flight after flight, gasping for air. I could practically feel eyes at my back, watching me with something akin to malice. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. My flashlight bounced wildly, revealing only snapshots of peeling walls and rust-stained handrails. Each flicker of shadow seemed to contain a figure reaching out for me. When I burst through the door at the bottom of the stairs, I almost collapsed in relief, only to find myself back in the lobby. Everything looked distorted in my panic-fueled vision. The dusty furniture, the toppled lamp, the scattered papers, all of it appeared warped by my heightened terror. My mind screamed at me to leave. to get out of that place. I sprinted past the reception desk and pushed open the front doors. Outside, the stillness of the night was a shocking contrast to the tension inside. The faint hum of the cargo trains in the distance felt almost comforting, but I couldn't shake the sensation of being followed. I dashed across the hotel's courtyard, my breath coming in uneven bursts. When I reached the fence, I froze. The gate, an old iron gate that I hadn't even noticed before, was now standing wide open, but I distinctly remembered climbing over a fence to get in. My heart skipped a beat, and my mind reeled with questions. Had it always been open? Had someone or something unlocked it while I was inside? An irrational shiver ran up my spine. I darted through the open gate, not bothering to look back. My car was parked a short distance away, beneath a flickering lamp that provided scant illumination. I fumbled for my keys, dropping them once in my haste. My hands were shaking so violently that I struggled to fit the key into the lock. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and throw myself into the driver's seat. My lungs burned as I tried to catch my breath, and a cold sweat clung to my skin. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing behind the car, but there was no one there. Just the desolate street, empty and menacing. I started the engine and pulled away, the tires scraping against the curb. As I left, I caught one last glimpse of the hotel in the rearview mirror. In that brief moment, I thought I saw a faint light flicker in one of the upper windows, like a pale glow moving across the glass. It could have been my imagination, but at that point, I couldn't tell what was real and what fear had conjured in my mind. My throat felt tight and my hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. The entire drive home, my heart refused to slow down. My thoughts swirled with possibilities. Was someone actually there, lurking in the shadows, guarding whatever was in those bags? Or had my own paranoia made the quiet building come alive with horrors? The memory of those footprints in the dust, that plastic rustling, and the sense of being followed haunted me. Every time I thought about the open gate, my stomach knotted. I'd gone in by scaling a fence, yet I fled through a gate that shouldn't have been open. It felt like a message or warning that someone or something had seen me and wanted me gone. When I finally reached my apartment, I felt only a marginal sense of safety. I locked my door and kept the lights on in every room, still half expecting to hear a second set of footsteps. My camera remained zipped in its bag on the kitchen table. I couldn't bear to look at the pictures then. Even the act of thinking about reviewing them filled me with dread, as if the camera might have captured something my eyes couldn't see. I was drenched in sweat, and my hands still shook. The fear didn't subside, lingering like an echo in my chest. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the dark corridors, the stacked black bags, and the intangible presence that seemed to watch from the corners. I caught myself second-guessing whether it was all a product of my own jittery nerves, but I'd never felt fear like that, so visceral, so relentless. Part of me wondered if the chemical smell had tampered with my senses or induced some hallucinatory paranoia. Yet a deeper instinct told me it was more than just fumes. It was that feeling you get when you know you're being observed, a primal dread that defies easy explanation. Even now, I haven't told many people about that night. When I do speak of it, I use cautious, measured words. I describe the rotting furniture, the dusty air, the strange footprints, and the open gate. I mention the unnerving sense of being followed, but there are things I keep to myself, like the rustling plastic, the subtle shuffle in the darkness, and the paralyzing certainty that something was aware of me. In quiet moments, I replay the final image of the hotel in my rearview mirror, that fleeting glow in the top floor window. I still feel that same knot of unease in my stomach, a persistent reminder that I might have stumbled upon something best left undisturbed. My only relief is that I got out when I did, because a part of me believes that if I had stayed longer, I would have discovered something much worse than my own fear. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine returning, rationalizing that daylight might strip the place of its terror. But deep down, I know that the feeling I had in that building was more than just a trick of the dark. It was a warning, a silent message echoing off peeling wallpaper and dusty floors. Some doors are better left locked, some secrets remain hidden for a reason, and so I remain haunted by that night. Haunted not by what I saw, but by what I might have seen if I had stayed. That lingering doubt, that uneasy awareness, is more than enough to keep me far, far away from that abandoned hotel on the outskirts of the freight station. And whenever I pass by the area, even if it's just on the highway, I can feel the memories stir in my chest. A quiet terror that refuses to let go. A sharp chill ran through me the moment I stepped out of my car and peered over the rusted fence. There was something unnervingly quiet about that open field, where once a small traveling amusement park had set up its swirling lights, thunderous music, and cotton candy stands. Under the moonlight, twisted metal frames and half-collapsed booths rose like eerie silhouettes against a clouded sky. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as though the darkness itself was watching from behind those empty rides. I knew I shouldn't be there, especially not at that hour, but my curiosity was stronger than the warning twinge in my gut, and so I hopped over the fence, letting the clang of my shoes hitting the other side reverberate through that abandoned realm. I had always been intrigued by this place. Years ago, a traveling amusement company had arrived with promises of joy and excitement. They constructed part of the park on a patch of open land just outside our town, halfway between a major road that led to the neighboring city. But for reasons nobody fully understood, the company vanished before they ever officially opened the gates. They left behind the scaffolding of rides, half-assembled equipment, and rotting concession stands. Some said it was a financial dispute. Others whispered about safety violations too severe to ignore. Regardless of the cause, the result was an unsettling graveyard of rust and disappointment. Whenever I drove by, I could see the skeletal outline of a Ferris wheel, the battered remains of a carousel, and several partially dismantled attractions. Each time, a deep, unshakable urge gnawed at me to explore what lay beyond the sagging chain-link fence. Tonight, I finally surrendered to that temptation. The night air felt thick in my lungs, weighed down by an inexplicable sense of foreboding. My heart thudded against my ribcage as I took my first steps inside. My flashlight flickered across piles of twisted metal, shards of plastic, and wooden beams warped by rain. The smell of damp earth mixed with corroded steel filled my nostrils, and I could taste the metallic tang on my tongue. I told myself to keep calm, but the dryness in my mouth and the slight tremor in my hands betrayed the anxiety building within me. First, I wandered through what looked like the remains of bumper cars. Their shells were heaped in one corner, seats ripped out, wires dangling like entrails. I ran my fingers over the jagged edge of a car's hood and felt the crumbly orange rust flake away. My stomach churned when my flashlight caught the reflection of a mirror at the back of what used to be the ride's queue area. The mirror was cracked in several places, each fissure spreading like a spider's web. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in that mirrored surface. A quick flicker in the corner of my eye. I spun around, scanning the darkness for any sign of life, but only silence greeted me. In my mind, I told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. Gradually, I found myself drawn to the abandoned carousel. Even from afar, I could see that it had been stripped of its canopy. The poles that once held the painted horses upright jutted out of the platform at odd angles. A few horse fragments lay scattered around, cracked torsos with chipped pastel paint and broken limbs. I approached one of the discarded horse heads. Its wide, vacant eyes and snarling teeth gave me a start. Up close, the craftsmanship was almost lifelike. It was as if the horse had died mid-gallop, its last expression permanently frozen in that bizarre smile. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold drop of sweat trickle down my temple. The entire scene reeked of abandonment and misplaced dreams. Stepping carefully around the carousel platform, I tried to move quietly, but every plank underfoot groaned in protest, as if warning me to turn back. The wind picked up, making the old metal signs overhead rattle like angry spirits. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, though logic told me I was alone. No one else would bother venturing into this forsaken carnival at midnight. At least that's what I kept telling myself whenever a jolt of paranoia surged through my system. I pressed forward, shining my flashlight across the bent frames of ticket booths and the skeleton of a Ferris wheel. The Ferris wheel seats had been removed, leaving only the towering circle of steel. Something about its incomplete shape unsettled me. The missing pieces emphasized its vacancy, and the structure itself seemed to loom overhead like an enormous silent sentinel. In the darkness, it was less a ride and more a menacing sculpture. Eventually, I reached a large console station, presumably the control room for one of the bigger attractions. Maybe a drop tower or roller coaster that never got fully installed. The booth was a cramped aluminum shed on a small elevated platform, its door hanging crookedly off one hinge. Wires spilled out from inside as if torn or stripped in haste. The odor of burnt plastic hit my nose, and I spotted scorched patches on the walls. Somebody had definitely been there. The question was how recently. I climbed up the rickety steps, each one sagging and squeaking under my weight. Inside the booth, I found broken switches, circuit boards, and battered control panels. My flashlight caught the glint of fresh scratches on the metallic surface. It looked like someone had tried to pry open compartments or rip out copper wiring. Bits of insulation and stripped wire lay strewn across the floor. My pulse drummed heavier now because it meant I wasn't alone in my fascination with this place. Someone else had been harvesting valuable parts, and who knew if they might return. Perhaps they were still there, creeping around in the shadows. I stepped back out of the booth and spotted fresh footprints in the layer of dust. My breath hitched as I knelt to inspect them. They looked fresh enough that the wind hadn't covered them. That hint of dryness in my mouth intensified, and I had to swallow hard to keep my composure. Before I could decide what to do, a faint metallic clang echoed from somewhere behind the booth, followed by a scraping noise. The sound made my blood turn cold. Slowly, I turned off my flashlight to avoid attracting attention. My ears strained to pinpoint the source of the noise. As I realized that the sound came from just around the corner of the control station, my skin crawled. I heard a rustling, then a distinct snap of something metal being forced open. It occurred to me that whoever it was might be armed, or at least wielding tools that could be used aggressively. The notion that I might be stumbling into an encounter with a desperate scavenger sent a shiver from my scalp down my spine. Stepping gingerly, I crept to the edge of the booth and peered around. In the faint moonlight, I could make out a tall figure crouched by a small steel box, presumably the base of another control panel. The figure's hands worked furiously, yanking wires and unscrewing bolts. I caught the glint of a tool in their grip. My heart hammered, my palms slick with sweat. The temptation to call out or demand an explanation seized me, but my throat felt locked shut. All I could think was that I didn't belong here, and that getting discovered in this situation could end very badly. I ducked down, pressing my back against the aluminum siding of the booth. The cold metal felt shocking against my skin through my jacket. The scraping, wrenching sounds continued. My stomach twisted into knots. My own breathing became shallow, almost too loud in my ears. Every instinct told me to slip away unnoticed. Yet, for reasons I still don't fully understand, I lingered, caught between fear and a strange compulsion to witness more of this twisted place. The wind shifted, carrying the pungent smell of rust and damp earth straight to my nose. My eyes watered from the odor. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle of feet on gravel, accompanied by a low grunt, as if the figure was exerting themselves. Suddenly the scraping stopped. My muscles tensed and I held my breath. There was a heartbeat of silence that felt like an eternity. Then came a new sound, footsteps, and they were coming closer. I realized with mounting dread that the figure might have sensed my presence. Perhaps a stray beam of my flashlight had caught their attention, or the quiet squeak of my shoes on the platform had betrayed me. I had to get out. Slowly, inch by inch, I started retreating from the booth, staying as low as possible. My breath was shaky and I could feel sweat trickling down the back of my neck. The hush around me deepened, as if the entire place was holding its breath. I paused when I heard a soft metallic click followed by a faint mutter. Though I couldn't make out the words, the tone was intense, frustrated, maybe even angry. The steps became louder, crunching broken debris. I couldn't risk waiting around to see who this person was. My mind conjured 100 scenarios, each more menacing than the last. Carefully, I tiptoed away from the console area, weaving through overturned benches and battered tarps. The open space of the field felt too exposed, so I ducked behind one of the half-collapsed concession stands. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, each throb pulsing in my temples. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. The wind whistled through the battered boards, creating a chorus of mournful groans that seemed to taunt me. I tried to calm myself, silently repeating that I just needed to reach the fence and slip out, but as I peeked around the corner of the concession stand, I caught another flicker of movement. A figure passed along the perimeter, moving parallel to where I stood. They were carrying something heavy, tools, or maybe a chunk of machinery. Their posture was rigid, and even though the darkness concealed their features, I could sense an air of hostility radiating from them, like they were coiled, ready to react to any intrusion. That was when the real dread took hold of me. My thoughts became muddled, and for a moment I wondered if I was still alone with that single scavenger. Strange shapes danced at the edges of my vision, as though shadows had a life of their own. The battered rides seemed to loom closer, and the half-gutted carousel horses on the ground looked as though they were crawling toward me, their eyes following my every move. I blinked hard, trying to reset my vision, but the creeping sense of being watched persisted. My mouth was so dry I could barely swallow, and I felt a tremor in my left hand. That's when I questioned whether it was all real. The idea that maybe this place was more than just rust and abandoned equipment surged through my mind. There was a certain energy here, a charged, oppressive gloom that pressed in on me. I recalled stories about haunted fairgrounds and ghostly apparitions in old amusement parks, how they supposedly retained echoes of laughter and music that never quite went away. My rational side tried to dismiss those thoughts as nonsense, yet standing there, alone under that ink-black sky, I couldn't fully convince myself it wasn't true. Suddenly, I detected a glimmer of light. A faint glow began to illuminate a portion of the field, flickering as though it came from a small flashlight or phone. I heard faint clinking as the unknown figure rummaged through another metal box. The glow highlighted random corners of twisted metal and made the shadows dance in unnerving shapes. Each time the beam shifted, I tensed, worried it would catch me. I moved as quietly as possible along the side of the concession stand, stepping over broken crates and leaning away from the scattered glass shards. My breath felt ragged in my chest, and my pulse refused to slow. A phrase from my past echoed in my head. Someone once warned me that curiosity could be a dangerous thing, especially at night in places that weren't meant for prying eyes. I couldn't help but feel I was paying the price for ignoring that warning. A sudden gust of wind swept through, carrying a swirling cloud of dust and grit that forced me to shield my face. My eyes stung, and I blinked away tears as my vision blurred. In that moment of disorientation, I heard a sharp clang echo from behind me, loud enough to make me jump. A jolt of fear shot through my body. I spun around, half expecting to see the figure inches away. Instead, I found myself staring at the battered remains of a sign that had toppled from a dilapidated stand, apparently loosened by the gust. The sign hit the ground with a final metallic crash, raising a puff of dust. But the real horror was that the noise would certainly draw attention to my location. My lungs seized as I realized there was no more use in trying to be stealthy. I turned and bolted, stumbling around the side of the carousel, stepping on rotted planks that threatened to break under my weight. My flashlight was still off, so I relied on moonlight to guide me. The exit fence was straight ahead, maybe 100 feet away. I could already imagine the relief of swinging my leg over that fence and returning to the safety of my car. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it could be heard for miles. As I ran, the environment seemed to blur, the battered rides and leaning stalls melting into elongated shadows. My senses were on fire. I felt every shift in the wind, heard every creak of metal in the distance. In my frenzy, I thought I glimpsed a humanoid shape lingering near a broken ticket booth, but it vanished when I tried to focus. A trick of the darkness or something more. My mind was in no state to make rational judgments. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The tall fence loomed before me. I wasted no time hurling myself at it. My hands shook, making it difficult for me to grab onto the links. Finally, my fingers found their grip and I pulled myself up. My muscles strained, sweat coating my palms, threatening to cause me to slip, but I managed to get a leg over. Jumping down the other side, I landed awkwardly on the damp grass, sending a jolt of pain through my ankle. I swallowed a cry, fearing it might alert anyone still on the other side. For several seconds, I crouched there trying to catch my breath, forcing myself to slow the thunderous gallop of my heart. I glanced back at the park. The silhouettes of the dismantled rides stood in silent vigil, illuminated by the moon. A wave of relief washed over me as I realized the fence was between me and whatever lurked inside. But that relief was fleeting. My mind replayed the sensation of being watched. The glimpses of moving shadows and the knowledge that a scavenger or something more disturbing was scouring the park. Shakily, I made my way back to my car. The silence of the surrounding countryside felt hostile, and each rustle in the nearby bushes set my nerves on edge. Once inside my vehicle, I locked the doors and just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, waiting for my heart to return to a semi-normal pace. I realized how easily the situation could have escalated had I been caught snooping. My body still trembled with leftover adrenaline and cold sweat. I replayed the encounter with the mysterious figure, the harsh scraping and rummaging, the feeling of them edging closer. I started the engine. My headlights flared to life. For a split second, I thought I saw a shape move near the fence, but by the time I focused, it was gone. Perhaps it was only a fleeting trick of light, or maybe it was the same presence watching me leave. I didn't dare linger to find out. I drove away, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Even now, hours later, my mind refuses to settle. Each time I close my eyes, I see the battered carousel horses strewn across the ground, their chipped eyes seeming fixed on me. I hear the metallic grind of a wrench twisting something free in the dark, and I sense the oppressive weight of that place pressing down on me. I can't stop asking myself if what I experienced was purely mundane, a run-in with a random salvager, or if something else lingers there. The swirling shadows and ghostly shapes keep gnawing at the edges of my memory. I suspect I won't find answers anytime soon. The only thing I know for sure is that I stepped into that abandoned park after midnight, driven by a fascination I can't explain, and encountered a darkness deeper than I'd ever imagined. Whether it was my fear-twisting reality, or some force genuinely tied to that deserted funfair, the result is the same, a sense of dread that follows me long after I've locked my doors and turned on all the lights at home. Sometimes in the quiet moments just before sleep, I swear I can still hear the faint creak of metal and the distant echo of carnival music that never had the chance to play, and each time my heart races, reminding me of the night I crawled into that forsaken park and nearly lost my grip on reason. I remember the night air feeling strangely stagnant, as if something in the darkness was holding its breath, waiting for the right moment to exhale. The city lights behind me offered little comfort, flickering in the rearview mirror like distant flares signaling my retreat. My heart was already in my throat before I even stepped out of the car, though I had no logical reason to feel that way. Yet there I was, heartbeat thudding in my ears, hands suddenly clammy on the steering wheel, staring at the hulking silhouette of a long-abandoned metalworks plant across the street. Something about that place felt off from the very start, an oppressive presence, a quiet promise of something I wasn't supposed to see. I work part-time as a security guard. It isn't exactly a glamorous job, but it pays the bills and grants me pockets of free time here and there. Whenever I'm off duty, I like to drive around aimlessly, letting the roads lead me to obscure corners of the city. I find it cathartic, almost meditative, to explore these forgotten districts where life once thrived but has since faded into rusted steel and crumbling brick. Usually these drives are mundane. I cruise the neglected streets, observe the half-demolished architecture, and sometimes snap a few photos if something interesting catches my eye. That night, however, was different. That night, I discovered a neighborhood so deserted and decayed, it felt like I had rolled into another dimension. The industrial ruins were spread out like an abandoned graveyard of factories. Chain-link fences riddled with holes seemed to guard nothing of worth. Broken windows gaped like soulless eyes, and the roads were full of potholes as if they too had given up on guiding people anywhere. I parked near the rusted gates of a large disused metalworks plant. A corroded sign, barely legible, read something like Timber and Sons Metal Fabrication, though the letters had peeled away in places. Curiosity tugged at me. The sagging fence had a sizable gap at the bottom, and the overgrowth behind it made it clear no one had officially set foot there in ages. Yet some gut feeling told me this wasn't merely a vacant lot. I slipped through the gap, feeling the chain links scrape the back of my jacket. The concrete beyond was thick with dust, gravel, and scattered debris. An odd hush blanketed the area. Even the distant hum of the city felt muffled, like I'd crossed an invisible barrier into an entirely separate realm. My breathing grew shallow. It's a sensation I've encountered a few times on the job when patrolling a silent building at night. This heightened awareness that makes every hair on your body stand on end. It felt like an unspoken warning. Tread carefully. Something's not right here. The main entrance to the plant had collapsed at some point, forcing me to pick my way around jagged beams and splintered wood. Eventually, I slipped into a wide corridor, the walls lined with old metal racks and half-dismantled machinery. A thick layer of dust coated every surface, yet I immediately noticed sets of footprints pressed into that dusty film. They weren't especially large. Some looked like ordinary work boots, others possibly sneakers, but they were fresh enough that the edges of each footprint remained crisp, undisturbed by time or wind. Whoever made them must have been there recently, and the realization caused my stomach to tighten. A cold sweat formed on my forehead. My chest felt tighter, as though the stagnant air was pressing inward. I followed the footprints deeper into the corridor, seeing that they diverged at times, merging again at random intervals. The overhead fluorescent lights were obviously long dead, leaving me dependent on the narrow beam of my flashlight, which felt woefully inadequate as it cut through the swirling dust motes. Each step I took echoed in that cavernous space, and my imagination began to conjure shapes in the corners of my vision, shadows that seemed to shift whenever I tried to focus on them. Soon I reached a vast open area with towering ceilings, presumably where massive machinery had once operated. Rusted conveyor belts stretched out like fossilized serpents, and I saw rows of dismantled presses leaning against the walls. In the center of the floor stood a large iron table toppled on its side. Behind it, something caught my eye, a small cloth, partially visible in the flickering beam of my flashlight. It was stained with something dark, and the color was so murky I couldn't be sure if it was dried oil, grease, or something else. The cloth looked out of place, too new for such a crumbling environment. This sent a chill racing up my spine. That chill intensified when I noticed small metal cups placed around the area, each one blackened at the rim, as if used to hold candles or some sort of wick. A few wax drippings on the floor confirmed that these had been lit recently. Combined with the footprints, it all pointed to a group using this spot for some clandestine purpose. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stumbling upon a site of secret gatherings, maybe drifters, or possibly people engaged in more unsettling rituals. The air felt heavier there, as if something or someone were watching from the darkness just beyond my flashlight's reach. My pulse hammered so loudly I could practically feel the throbbing in my temples. I swallowed hard. My mouth was like sandpaper. The absolute silence of the place began to warp my perception, and every tiny noise, my own soft exhale, the scrape of my shoe against a piece of debris, seemed magnified to a deafening level. I tried to slow my breathing, but every attempt only made me more aware of how alone I was, and yet not alone if the footprints were any indication. As I crouched next to the iron table to inspect the cloth, a faint glow caught my eye from the far corner of the room. My heart lurched. Lifting my flashlight, I realized there was a side corridor hidden behind a half-collapsed wall leading deeper into the structure. From that corridor, I heard what could only be described as hushed voices. They were distant enough that I couldn't make out the words, if there were actual words being spoken, but it was definitely more than one person. Perhaps it was chanting, or maybe just the muffled murmur of conversation. Either way, my nerves felt like live wires. Every muscle in my body tensed. The logical part of me said to leave immediately, to get back to my car and forget this place existed. But I'm naturally inquisitive, and that curiosity battled fiercely with my sense of self-preservation. I decided to move closer, shutting off my flashlight for fear of being noticed. The darkness was all-consuming, forcing my eyes to strain in the dim glow that trickled in from broken sections of the roof far above. My pulse slammed in my chest, like a warning drum. Small beads of sweat rolled down my face, and I wiped them away with an unsteady hand. As I inched along the wall, the echoes of the voices became slightly clearer, though they still felt distant and echoey, as if they were coming from multiple directions at once. I couldn't tell if this was some acoustic anomaly of the old factory, or if there were indeed multiple groups of people spread out in the darkness. My surroundings took on a strange, almost dreamlike quality. The corridors felt like they were shifting around me, and I got the unsettling impression that I could become lost if I ventured any farther. My sense of direction wavered as if the entire structure was reconfiguring itself to keep me inside. Then came a soft scraping sound behind me, like metal dragging across the concrete floor. My mind raced. Was it just a piece of debris I had kicked unknowingly, or was someone standing mere feet behind me, hidden in the darkness, making a subtle movement? I whipped around, my heart nearly exploding out of my chest, only to see nothing but empty space. The beam of my flashlight revealed the same dusty path I had just traversed, but I couldn't shake the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, that primal instinct telling me something had been there a moment ago. The tension wound itself tighter around my chest, making every breath a struggle. Fear turned my legs to jelly, and for a second I was convinced they might give out entirely. Pressing forward a few feet more, I found the opening of the side corridor. The temperature seemed to drop drastically in that area, a surprising chill that clung to my skin. The voices were closer now, still impossible to decipher. They rose and fell in an almost rhythmic pattern, and the air vibrated with anxious energy. I couldn't decide if the sound was human or something more ominous. My rational mind insisted it must be a group of people, maybe squatters, or cult-like individuals performing some clandestine ceremony. But a growing part of me suspected that the boundaries of reason were bending in that place, that I might be hearing something that defied logical explanation. At that point, my body was trembling. My fingers felt numb from tension, my palms slick with sweat. I tried to swallow again, but my throat felt as though it had closed up completely. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I leaned against the wall, suddenly dizzy. My heart pounded so violently that my vision seemed to pulse along with it, black spots dancing at the corners of my eyes. Standing there teetering on the edge of panic, I recalled what a coworker once told me in dangerous situations: the best thing you can do is trust your instincts. My instincts were screaming at me to get out. Still, some bizarre pull kept me rooted, a mixture of horror and fascination. I could almost sense the corridor breathing, inhaling and exhaling, like a lung expanding with stale air. Every nerve in my body demanded that I turn around, but my curiosity pinned me in place. Suddenly, I heard the faintest shuffle of feet behind that half-collapsed wall. If the distant voices had spurred anxiety, this new sound triggered raw panic. It was extremely close, as if someone had crept up to the corner, maybe even leaning their head out to see who was skulking around in the dark. My stomach flipped, and the hair on my arms stood on end. In the thick silence that followed, my own ragged breathing felt obscenely loud. I stood motionless for a few agonizing seconds, eyes fixed on that corner, flashlight aimed but switched off to avoid detection. I sensed an intent gaze focused on me from just beyond the vantage point. My heart hammered so wildly that I was sure anyone nearby could hear it echoing off the cavernous walls. At any second, I expected to see a shadowy figure materialize, or perhaps hands reaching out from the darkness. Yet nothing emerged. My mind flickered through potential scenarios: trespassers defending their hideout, a group performing unauthorized activities, or something far more sinister. Fear swallowed me so thoroughly that my rational thought process nearly collapsed. I wanted no part of a confrontation, especially in an isolated, crumbling factory at the dead of night. Gathering what little courage I had left, I started to back away, keeping my eyes locked on that corner. Each step felt as though I were walking through knee-deep sludge, my legs weighed down by adrenaline and dread. When I was a safe distance from that corridor, I turned on my flashlight again, nearly dropping it because of my trembling fingers. I retraced my steps, trying desperately to remain silent, but every small crunch of debris underfoot sent shivers of paranoia through me. The emptiness of the vast room seemed to amplify every noise, as if mocking my attempts to stay hidden. I made it back to the area with the toppled iron table, the blackened cups, and that stained cloth. Even in my panicked state, I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was now. The voices had either stopped or faded into a pitch so low I couldn't hear them anymore. I practically sprinted for the collapsed entrance. It felt as though invisible hands were pressing down on my shoulders, urging me to move faster. Despite the darkness, I found my way back to the gap in the fence, my chest heaving with exhaustion and terror. The moment I crawled through that opening and stood on the other side, a surge of relief washed over me, though the sense of being watched remained. Adrenaline flooded my system, and I half expected to see silhouettes peering out from behind the broken glass windows, tracking my every move. The night sky above had never looked so welcoming, and I staggered toward my car with the single-minded focus of a survivor fleeing a trap. Once inside the car, I locked the doors immediately, my breath hitching in shallow bursts. I flicked on the interior light, scanning the back seat in paranoid haste, though I found nothing unusual. My entire body still trembled, and my shirt clung to my skin, damp with cold sweat. My heart wouldn't stop hammering, an insistent reminder that I had pushed too far into a place where I didn't belong. In the rearview mirror, that monstrous structure loomed, its broken windows resembling the hollow sockets of a skull. I thought I detected a faint flicker of light in one of the upper floors, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. My instincts screamed for me to drive away before something else happened. I started the engine, my hands shaking so hard I had to steady them on the steering wheel. As I pulled out of that forsaken industrial park, the oppressive heaviness lingered in the pit of my stomach. Even once I reached the relative safety of more populated streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, or at least marked by whatever I had encountered. Glancing in the mirrors, my eyes played tricks on me. Shadows morphed into vague silhouettes, and streetlights flickered more than they should. The more rational side of my brain insisted I was just jumpy, traumatized by the experience. Yet a deeper part of me believed something else was at play, something not entirely bound by the ordinary laws of reality. I spent the rest of the night in a state of growing paranoia, replaying every detail of what had happened: the footprints in the dust, the melted wax, the stained cloth, and those indecipherable voices echoing in the corridor. I questioned whether I had stumbled upon a cult, a network of clandestine rituals, or perhaps a group that dabbled in something beyond human comprehension. My imagination ran wild, conjuring scenarios of hidden societies and malevolent forces drawn to places steeped in abandonment. Even now, days later, I still feel a weight in my chest whenever I recall that corridor and the sound of muffled voices. Late at night, I swear I can hear a faint murmur when everything is quiet, like a distant echo that followed me home. My dreams have become strange and disjointed, plagued by flashes of that toppled iron table, the blackened cups, and the flickering shadows on the factory walls. I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding against my ribcage as if trying to break free. Part of me yearns to go back, to face that place again with more resolve, to discover whether my mind was merely playing tricks. But the other part, the sensible part, recoils at the very thought. The memory is enough to curdle my blood, stirring an undercurrent of dread that makes my palms sweat even as I write this. Some doors I've come to realize are best left unopened, and some places, heavy with secrets and a past that refuses to remain buried, should be left to decay in silence. I don't know if whatever I encountered that night was purely human, or if some unnatural influence was at work. What I do know is that I felt a presence there, an oppressive, watchful force that seemed to tangle itself with the metal and dust, filling the corridors with a life of its own. The strange footprints, the cryptic murmurs, and that dark-stained cloth felt like pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to solve. Driving away was my only option, and I'm relieved I didn't linger. But sometimes, in my most unsettling moments, I wonder if that malignant presence latched onto me somehow, hitching a ride in my subconscious. The city's neon glow and the bustle of everyday life do little to dispel that lingering aura of dread. Even on my regular security shifts, I find myself jumping at the slightest noise, convinced that I'll turn a corner and see those same footprints in the dust, leading somewhere I can't return from. I haven't told many people about what happened, mostly because I'm not sure if they'd believe me or if I entirely believe myself. Without fail, though, every time I pass a deserted lot or a vacant warehouse, my chest tightens. I can almost hear the echoes of distant whispers, feel the gaze of unseen eyes crawling across my skin, reminding me of that night in the old metalworks plant. My hope is that I never encounter anything like that again, yet a small voice inside warns me that some door has been unlocked. Whether I want it or not, the oppressive aura from that industrial labyrinth is now a part of me, refusing to fade, ever so quietly lurking just out of sight, and that above all else is what truly terrifies me. The moment I set foot inside the Galloway Arms, I felt an undercurrent of unease beneath its polished veneer, like a draft slipping through a sealed window. The lobby's antique decor looked picturesque in the afternoon light, but there was something in the atmosphere that felt off. Perhaps it was the way the shadows stretched across the vintage check-in desk, or how the chandelier's reflection wavered in the polished floor despite no discernible breeze. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but every hair on the back of my neck stood at attention, as if the walls themselves carried a presence waiting to unfold. I was there for a simple reason, attending a 3-day conference in a small town I had never visited before. However, in the first few seconds inside that old hotel, I felt more like a wary traveler stepping into a territory that did not want me present. I remember hauling my suitcase down the dimly lit corridor toward my assigned room. The hallway lights were subdued, casting elongated silhouettes of the potted plants against the worn carpet. There was a faint smell of lavender potpourri mixed with something else, something stale, like old water left to sit in a vase for too long. My room was at the far end, and the door creaked when I unlocked it, revealing an interior that was surprisingly cozy, floral wallpaper, heavy drapes, and a deep green carpet that muffled my footsteps. The queen-sized bed looked inviting, and there was a small desk set against the window, complete with a dusty lamp and a traditional telephone. The TV was perched on a wooden dresser, its outdated design a reminder that the hotel's charm came with age. On my first day, everything seemed ordinary enough. I attended the conference sessions, introduced myself to a few colleagues, and grabbed a quick dinner in the lobby restaurant. A staff member, noticing my interest in the building's architecture, mentioned that the hotel had been around for decades. The owners had updated some features, but left most of the original structure intact. I found the history intriguing, though a hint of that earlier unease still nagged at my mind. That night I slept soundly, no oddities, no disturbances, just a mild sense that I was being watched as I switched off the lamp. I even brushed the feeling aside, attributing it to fatigue. It was on the second night that I awoke to an unexpected glow. The first thing I noticed was the static hiss, that crackling sound that comes from an untuned channel. My eyes snapped open, and I saw the television flickering in the dark, spewing random bursts of static and faint, half-formed images that scrambled across the screen. The volume was low but unmistakable. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I tried to recall whether I had turned the TV off before bed. I was certain I had, but clearly it was on now. I fumbled for the remote on the nightstand and managed to shut it off, noticing only then how clammy my hands felt. Perhaps I had hit the remote button by mistake during the night, or maybe there was some internal timer. I was unnerved, yet I told myself there must be a reasonable explanation. I drifted back to sleep, though it was a restless one. The next morning I mentioned the incident in passing to the front desk clerk while checking on conference schedules. He offered to have a technician look into it, suggesting that older TVs sometimes powered on by themselves. It reassured me a little, but the quick mention that it wasn't the first time a guest had reported odd technical glitches unsettled me. Still, I shoved the thought to the back of my mind and focused on my conference obligations. The second day ended without incident, at least until I returned to my room late that evening. Exhausted from the day's lectures, I ate a light dinner, made sure the TV was off, and double-checked all the switches. I carefully placed the remote on top of the dresser this time, well out of reach. Perhaps a silly precaution, but it gave me a sense of control. Sleep took me quickly, but at around 2 in the morning, that flicker roused me again. This time the screen wasn't just static, it displayed fleeting shapes, swirling patterns that looked like silhouettes forming and dissolving in a wash of gray noise. The volume seemed higher, a sputtering chaos of white noise and bursts of distorted sound. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering so loudly that my eardrums throbbed. My tongue felt dry and each breath caught in my throat. I pressed the power button on the remote repeatedly until it finally shut off. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the darkness itself was suffocating the space. When I told reception about this second incident in the morning, the clerk nodded sympathetically, telling me once again that it was likely an electrical issue. A colleague passing by overheard and mentioned he had once stayed in a hotel where outdated wiring caused televisions to flicker on randomly. It sounded logical enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. I headed to the final day of the conference with a disquieting knot in my stomach. That evening I decided to ignore the creeping unease and turn in early, hoping for at least one solid night's rest before I left town the following morning. I had double-checked every possible power source, even pulled the TV's plug from the wall. Satisfied, I slipped under the sheets. Around midnight I woke up for no apparent reason. My eyes snapped open to near total darkness. I listened for the hum of the air conditioner, the drip of the bathroom faucet, any sign of normalcy. For a moment, nothing seemed to make sense. Then I noticed a dim glow pulsating across the room. Against all logic, I saw the TV screen lit, flickering with that staticky haze, even though I had physically disconnected it. Fear pulsed through me like an electric current. My lungs felt tight and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I forced myself to get out of bed. My bare feet sank into the carpet and immediately I felt something wet against my skin. The sensation was so unexpected that my breath caught in my throat. I took another step and the squishy feeling persisted and inexplicable dampness saturated the floor. A cold sweat trickled down my temples. I tried to remain rational, thinking there might be a leak or spilled water. Yet the air smelled oddly stale, reminiscent of algae or standing water left for days. As I groped along the wall for the light switch, my fingertips brushed something cold and solid, unmistakably shaped like a hand. The contact was slight, more of a brushed knuckle or the back of a palm, but it stopped me in my tracks. Every muscle in my body seized with terror, and I yanked my hand away as if I'd been burned. My breathing turned ragged, and I held my hand in front of me, half expecting to see a ghostly imprint on my skin. There was nothing there but goosebumps. No one stood in that spot. The darkness was uninterrupted except for the faint light from the cursed television. An icy dread spread through my chest as the realization sank in that something I couldn't see was physically there. I flicked the overhead lamp on and suddenly the TV snapped off, plunging the room into silence. My rational mind told me to pack my bags and leave that instant, but part of me questioned whether exhaustion was causing hallucinations. For a moment I stood panting, wiping sweat from my forehead, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I forced myself to kneel down and feel the carpet again. Sure enough, it was damp. I couldn't determine the source. I spent the next few hours perched on the edge of the bed, a lamp blazing. The next morning, I confronted the front desk once again. They insisted that a maintenance crew would investigate, but suggested that older plumbing in the building's infrastructure might lead to occasional leaks. It sounded blandly dismissive, but I lacked the energy to argue. All day at the conference, I struggled to concentrate, my focus shattered by replaying the night's events in my head. I questioned my own sanity. My chest would tighten each time I remembered that chilling encounter at the wall. Perhaps it was just a twisted trick of my imagination. Yet I couldn't ignore the wet socks I had discarded that morning, or the uncertain glances from the hotel staff when I described the damp carpet. It was as if they knew more than they let on, but not enough to provide any real explanation. On my final night, despite every instinct screaming at me to check out early, I returned to my room. A storm had gathered over the town, thunder echoing among the hills, raindrops hammering against the windows. Something about the barometric pressure made my ears pop in the hallway. The thick carpet seemed to swallow the sound of my own footsteps, creating an eerie sense of isolation. I had an uncanny feeling that the corridor was somehow darker than before, even though the overhead lights were on. My breath hitched and sweat trickled down my neck as I unlocked the door. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance, aside from the stale odor lingering in the air. I snapped on every light and turned on some music on my phone to keep my nerves steady, refusing to so much as glance at the television. Hours passed uneventfully, yet I couldn't relax. Every so often I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a presence hovering just at the edge of sight. My heart would speed up, and my palms would grow clammy. Then I would find nothing to confirm my suspicions. As the clock approached midnight, the storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through the curtains. Each flicker of light cast grotesque shapes across the walls, prompting me to recall the sensation of that ice-cold hand. Eventually, my exhaustion overcame my fear. I turned off the music and lights, leaving only the faint glow from the bedside lamp. Curling under the blankets, I fought the urge to stay awake. My eyelids grew heavy. Maybe an hour later, I stirred to a soft hum. For a split second, I thought it was the static again, but when I opened my eyes, the television remained dark. Relief washed over me until I realized the hum came from somewhere else. It was a deep resonance, like a muffled moan reverberating through water. The sound grew louder, resonating in my chest. My breathing quickened, adrenaline forcing me fully awake. My eyes struggled to adjust in the gloom, searching for the source. The lamp by the bed flickered, and in that momentary darkness, I glimpsed movement near the wall. Something rippled along the wallpaper like a dark stain spreading outward. My stomach lurched as I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It had a subtle three-dimensionality, a depth that defied logic. I sat up, my body trembling with acute terror. The hum pitched higher, a vibration that set my teeth on edge. Before I could muster the courage to move, lightning illuminated the room for a split second, and I saw a shape translucent and shifting like water in a glass. My mouth went bone dry, my limbs locked in place. I tried to call for help, but no sound emerged, just a strangled gasp. In the afterflash of the lightning, the shape dissipated into the wallpaper. My mind reeled, grappling with the insane sight. A nauseating wave of dizziness washed over me, as though reality had tilted on its axis. The hum subsided, and in the suffocating silence that followed, I could barely breathe. That was enough for me. Fueled by raw panic, I leaped out of bed, nearly stumbling as my foot sank into another wet patch on the carpet. The stench of stagnant water assaulted my senses. My heart raced uncontrollably. Sweat poured down my temples and into my eyes. I snatched my clothes, stuffing them haphazardly into my suitcase. The claustrophobic walls seemed to watch me as I hurried, the air thick with malevolent expectation. My mind screamed at me to leave, never to look back. I dragged my suitcase to the door and flung it open. The hallway was eerily silent, except for the steady rumble of thunder. The sense of something chasing me was overwhelming, but I saw nothing when I glanced back over my shoulder. My lungs burned and my vision blurred with a mixture of fear and tears of desperation. I half sprinted, half limped to the elevator, jabbing the button until the doors opened. In the reflection of the polished steel walls, I looked pale, my eyes wide like a man on the brink of hysteria. I reached the lobby, but it was deserted at this late hour. The front desk stood in half light, a single lamp illuminating a cluster of pamphlets for local attractions. I couldn't decide whether to ring the desk bell and demand an immediate checkout or simply run out the front door, leaving my room key behind. Eventually, I settled on dropping the key on the counter and heading straight for the exit. As I left, a flicker in the corner of my eye drew my attention to the antique mirror near the entrance. For the briefest moment, I saw that shape again, faint and rippling, as though beckoning me from inside the silvered glass. My stomach twisted in horror and I pushed the door open, stepping into the pounding rain with an overwhelming sense that I had just barely escaped something far beyond my understanding. I don't recall much of the drive that night, only that the storm battered the windshield relentlessly and every flash of lightning made me flinch. My hands clutched the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles ached. Once I reached the highway, I managed to pull over at a rest stop, my body shaking from head to toe. The fear hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown more potent now that I was outside that room. I kept feeling that icy coldness at my fingertips, a phantom sensation of brushing against something that shouldn't exist. Every thump of rain on the roof made me shudder. Even now, safe in my own home, recounting every detail in a futile attempt to rationalize what happened, I feel no sense of closure. The memory of the damp carpet and the flickering television lingers, haunting me with questions I have no answers to. Sometimes late at night, I find myself staring at the shadows in my bedroom, certain that I see a faint ripple on the wall. My heart races and the rush of blood in my ears sounds uncomfortably like that old static hiss. I keep telling myself it's just my imagination, yet I sleep with the lights on more often than not, too afraid that if the darkness settles in, I might feel that cold, wet presence once again. No matter how many times I reassure myself, there's a gnawing sense that something followed me from that room, something intangible, waiting for the right moment to reemerge. That knowledge weighs on my chest in the quiet hours of the night. I haven't told many people about my experience. Most wouldn't believe me anyway, but every now and then I'll have a conversation with someone who stayed at a similarly ancient hotel. They'll mention odd creaking sounds, televisions flickering to life, or watery stains that appear and vanish. I catch myself reliving every second of terror. I don't know if I fled an actual haunting or if my mind broke under stress. Either way, whenever I think about that room and the damp carpet under my bare feet, it sends a chill straight through my spine, and that is a chill I fear I will carry for the rest of my life. The moment I first stepped into that musty foyer, I sensed something was off. The building had been advertised as a hidden gem from the early 1900s, its architecture lovingly maintained throughout the decades. A grand staircase graced the lobby, with its banister polished to a near-mirror finish, and the mosaic-tiled floors still bore the faint shimmer of their original glaze. Yet there was an underlying current in the air, an almost tangible tension that prickled along my arms. If I closed my eyes and inhaled, I could swear I smelled old static, like the lingering charge left by a dying light bulb, or the ghostly hum of wires running behind aged plaster. I thought it might just be the thrill of renting a new space, the excitement of possibilities ahead, but I would soon realize my instincts had been warning me all along. I had been working as a freelance photographer for a few years, always on the lookout for a studio that could double as both a workspace and a client-friendly environment. High ceilings, large windows, those were essential to capture that beautiful diffused daylight. The advertisement had promised an impeccably preserved landmark, so I arranged a viewing. The leasing agent walked me through wide corridors, lined with dark wooden paneling and old-fashioned sconce lights. She remarked that the building was constructed at the turn of the century and had undergone various renovations over time. The owners had insisted on keeping the original aesthetic intact. She claimed everything worked perfectly, from the wiring to the plumbing, and assured me that the place was safe. I took her word for it and soon signed the lease. When I moved in, I couldn't help but admire the place for its historical charm. The door to my studio still had the original brass doorknob shaped like a lion's head, and the room itself boasted tall windows framed by thick velvet drapes. In one corner, I placed a vintage mirror where clients could adjust their outfits or makeup. This mirror, with its ornate metal frame and slightly warped surface, felt like it belonged in a bygone era. Setting up my photography equipment was a breeze because the interior had been retrofitted with modern electrical outlets, or so I was told. I tested each socket and found they worked fine, at least in the beginning. My first few photo sessions in the new studio went smoothly. Most of them took place during the day, with natural light streaming in and bathing my subjects in a warm glow. It was after dark, however, that I began to sense another side to the building. During one of my late-night editing marathons, I noticed an odd buzzing from the far corner of the studio, a soft yet persistent hum reminiscent of a faulty wire. It seemed to flicker in and out, like static searching for a frequency. Concerned, I meticulously checked the cables for my equipment. I turned off my lights, reset power strips, inspected every socket, yet nothing was amiss. Still, that buzzing lingered, just audible enough to crawl under my skin. A growing chill accompanied that noise, a sensation so immediate and piercing that it felt like a sudden drop in temperature. One moment I would be sitting at my computer, completely focused on retouching a portrait, and then a shiver would shoot down my spine. Forcing me to pause, my breath would catch, and I'd feel the hairs on my arms stand on end. No matter how many layers I wore, this cold spot at the corner of the room persisted. I tried rearranging my furniture, shifting my editing station to a different wall, anything to avoid working near that unsettling patch of air. But my attempts provided little relief. The chill seemed to follow me as if it had a will of its own. On one occasion, I was alone, late at night finalizing some headshots. I remember glancing at the clock and seeing that it was almost midnight. My eyes were heavy and my focus was faltering. I decided to call it a night. But before I could close my editing software, I heard a sudden crash. One of my reflectors, a sturdy stand that had been secure on level flooring, toppled over without any apparent reason. It didn't just tip, it slammed hard against the floor. My heart thudded in my chest like a drum. I rushed over to see if maybe a gust of wind had hit it, but all the windows were shut. I checked the base of the stand, thinking it might have been loose, but it was fully tightened. My mind tried to rationalize it, but my trembling hands gave away my real fear. Something inexplicable had just happened. That was the moment I began to scrutinize the mirror more carefully. At first I noticed nothing unusual. It was just a large ornamental piece of reflective glass. However, over the next few days I caught fleeting glimpses in its surface, an indistinct form that seemed out of place. It was never fully visible, like a trick of the light or a shadow at the edge of my vision. Yet I grew certain there was something else in that mirror, something that didn't exist in the physical confines of my studio. Whenever I tried to lock my gaze onto it, it disappeared as though it had never been there in the first place. I attempted to explain this phenomenon by telling myself I was overworked. Editing photos for 10 or 12 hours straight could make anyone's eyes play tricks. On top of that, the stress of running my own business sometimes weighed heavily. I even told a friend about my vision concerns, not mentioning the supernatural aspect, just the idea that I might be dealing with stress. He suggested checking my eyesight or taking short breaks every hour. I followed his advice, but the phantom presence in the mirror only grew more noticeable. Late at night when I was most fatigued, I'd see the form more clearly. It looked almost human, long-limbed, tall, but slightly distorted, as if viewed through rippling water. One evening, after a series of private sessions that dragged well past sunset, I decided to tidy the studio. I began folding backdrops, reorganizing equipment, and finally wiping down the mirror's surface. As I swept the cloth across the glass, the overhead light flickered. In that stutter of illumination, I thought I caught a distinct reflection that wasn't mine. It appeared behind me, motionless, an upright figure with an unreadable face. My lungs seized with panic. I spun around, searching the empty space. Nothing. But my heart was hammering hard enough that my ribs ached. My palms were damp with sweat, and a cold dribble ran down the back of my neck. In the days that followed, the buzzing in the corner became more frequent. It would start as a low hum, intensify to a crackling hiss, then vanish as quickly as it came. Each episode sent jolts of apprehension through me, making every nerve in my body tense. My respiration grew shallow, and I developed a habit of constantly looking over my shoulder. I found myself losing focus on my editing, making errors in color correction, or forgetting which files I had already processed. Paranoia crept in, leaving me wondering if the entire building was somehow messing with my head. Could old wiring cause auditory hallucinations? Could uneven floors cause light stands to topple? My sense of unease reached a breaking point when a colleague visited one afternoon to drop off some new lenses. He remarked that the building had a peculiar feel, and as he glanced around, I noticed him flinch. He mentioned in hushed tones that he felt like someone was watching him from the shadows. I tried to laugh it off, but inside I was reeling, my heart pounding, because it confirmed that I wasn't the only one picking up on something. Though we spoke only briefly, the implied message was clear. My studio harbored a presence. Spurred by that admission, I conducted my own small investigation. I took a flashlight and ventured into the hallway after everyone else in the building seemed to have gone home. Floorboards creaked beneath worn carpet runners, and the light cast flickering shapes on the walls. My footsteps echoed loudly, making me feel exposed. Despite the emptiness, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being tailed by some silent observer. I climbed a narrow flight of stairs to the next level, which was dimly lit by a single bulb. Nothing seemed especially out of order, but my skin crawled each time I passed a darkened doorway. Eventually, I circled back to my studio, frustrated and more anxious than ever. I had found no physical evidence of any intruder or hidden device that could explain the buzzing or the figure in the mirror. Back inside, I decided to face the mirror head-on. I turned off the main lights, leaving only a single lamp illuminated in the corner. The reflection in the mirror was hazy, lit by that lone source. I stared at my own image, noticing how drawn and tired I looked. My eyes flicked to the corners of the mirror's frame, searching for any sign of that presence. Just as I began to think it wouldn't appear, the overhead fixture flickered back to life on its own. In that sudden stuttering glow, I saw it once again behind me. This time its outline was sharper. My heart thundered so violently that I could hardly breathe. My instinctive reaction was to spin around in an attempt to catch it physically. Of course, there was only empty space. My entire body was cold. Sweat pooled at the base of my spine. I felt a dryness in my throat so severe it hurt to swallow. I spent that night sleeping in a motel, unable to remain in the studio. The next day, I arrived with renewed resolve. I told myself that if I was going to work in that space, I had to establish some form of control. Ignoring my trembling hands, I began a thorough inspection of every corner, every electrical cable, and every nook where the old architecture might hide some glitch. I replaced extension cords, taped down cables, tightened every light stand, and tested every socket. Everything was normal. No buzzing, no flickering, no cold spots. For a few hours, a hopeful calm settled over me. But that evening, it all returned worse than before. The hum echoed so loudly it sounded like there were insects trapped behind the walls. The overhead lights went from a steady glow to a frantic flicker, as if the circuit was overloaded. My breathing became ragged, and each exhalation sounded harsh in the quiet. That primal sense of dread, the one telling me to run, grew unstoppable. Yet something rooted me to the floor. I needed to see if the mirror would reveal anything final. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I aimed my camera at the mirror, hoping to capture whatever image I had been glimpsing. As I lifted the camera, my arms shook so badly I could scarcely frame the shot. The lens focused on the reflection, my anxious face, the shadowy corners of the studio behind me, and then a vague silhouette forming at the periphery. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed elongated by the mirror's curve. I pressed the shutter, releasing the flash in a burst of white light. In that instant, I heard a pop, and then the darkness consumed me. The overhead fixture had blown out completely, leaving me with the stark afterimage of the flash imprinted on my retinas. My ears rang and my heart pounded. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, shining it around to find I was once again alone. With trembling hands, I checked the photo on my camera. The shot was partially washed out from the flash, with a reflection of a bloom of white. But in the corner, there was the faintest outline of something that definitely wasn't me. My stomach twisted. My chest felt tight, as if the air were too thick to breathe. I understood then that this presence was no simple wiring fault, no mere symptom of my exhaustion. Something unexplainable resided in that mirror, or possibly in the very fabric of the building itself. I made a choice that night. I gathered my equipment hastily, not bothering to stow it neatly. My thoughts were a chaotic swirl of terror and determination. I reasoned that whatever was bound to the mirror in the corner of the studio wouldn't follow me outside the building. Perhaps it was confined to those ancient walls. Rather than allow panic to paralyze me, I decided to confront the situation with a final act. I lifted the mirror off its hooks, my arms jittery from fear. For a moment, I imagined seeing a face peering through the glass, but I forced myself to maintain composure and carry the mirror into the hallway. There, my plan was to leave it by the refuse area, letting someone else remove it. Just as I set it against the corridor wall, I felt a spike in the air, like static dancing across my skin. The lights overhead flickered. I stepped back, breath ragged, and retreated into my studio. The hum quieted. The chill in the corner lifted. My pulse, though still rapid, felt less like a stampede in my chest. In the following weeks, I continued to use the studio, but I made a point never to stay too late. Without that mirror, the disturbances diminished. The buzzing grew less frequent, the unnatural cold spots faded, and the sense of being watched subsided to a lingering caution rather than a suffocating dread. Still, I was uneasy. Even though the hair-raising incidents had lessened, I couldn't entirely trust the place. On more than one occasion, I found the new mirror I had brought in slightly askew, as if nudged by an unseen hand, but nothing as dramatic as before. I learned to deal with the building's quirks, doing my best to maintain a boundary between my daytime sessions and the oppressive energy that seemed to come out at night. Eventually, I captured enough stunning portraits and gained enough loyal clientele to justify moving to a different location, one without the heavy baggage of an unexplainable presence. However, I still keep a single frame print from that night, the one I shot at the mirror. At a glance, it looks like a poorly exposed photo of me, exhausted and wired from lack of sleep. But if you study it closely, you can make out a faint shape standing just behind my shoulder. Its proportions are distinctly off. I don't show it to clients, of course. It remains tucked away in a drawer, a reminder of that suffocating atmosphere and the terrifying sense that I was never really alone in that building. Even though I have long since moved on, I still sometimes wake in the dead of night, certain I hear that same low electrical hum. My heart will pound against my ribs, my mouth dry as sandpaper, and a cold sweat will break out across my back. In those moments I hold my breath and wait for the dreadful chill to pass. Part of me wonders if the presence I encountered was banished along with that antique mirror, or if it left some imprint on me that I can't wash away. The fear no longer grips me daily, but the unease remains like a splinter lodged deep in my mind. To this day, I can say for certain what I experienced in that old studio. Was it a restless spirit, a glitch in reality, or my own psyche unraveling under strain? Perhaps it was all three. In any case, I continue my photography career with a renewed respect for the boundaries between seen and unseen, and whenever I feel that prickling tension in the air, I make a swift exit, leaving no chance for the shadows to gain a foothold in my mind again. Yet, no matter how far I travel or how modern my new workspaces are, I can't help but glance at reflections with a lingering caution, remembering the silent figure that once stared back at me through warped glass in an old, forgotten building. I still remember the stale smell of ancient upholstery and dust clinging to my clothes as if it were determined never to let go. From the moment I set foot inside that old cinema, something felt deeply, viscerally wrong. The city itself had always carried a certain gloom beneath its facade. Once a cultural hotspot in the 1970s, now a pale echo of the vitality it once radiated. But the abandoned theater I chose to explore that evening seemed to harbor something darker than just neglect. It felt alive, like the building itself was breathing through every mildewed crack and peeling poster. It had been nursing a strange fascination with old disused movie houses for years. People around here often talk about them fondly, reminiscing about premiere nights and film festivals that once drew crowds dressed in their finest. Over time, those proud theaters were gradually overshadowed by modern shopping malls, their multiplex screens and neon signs banishing the grandeur of single-screen movie palaces. Many of these older places simply withered away, left to decay on lonely avenues. My curiosity about one particularly large building on a side street was not purely architectural. Something about its Art Deco facade, with its chipped features and the half-broken ticket booth, made me feel simultaneously drawn in and repelled. That night, I parked my car under a flickering lamppost. The structure loomed before me, tall, with a dark silhouette against a bruised sky. Rain from the previous day had left shallow puddles across the sidewalk, reflecting the neon glow of distant signs that struggled to penetrate the deepening gloom. I found a side entrance propped open by a chunk of concrete, suggesting that someone or something had taken advantage of the theater's vulnerability. My heart thrummed a little faster, and I wondered if I should just go home. But the lure of exploring these silent corridors from another era proved too strong. As soon as I pushed open the door, a musty blast of air struck my face. I stood still for a few seconds, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The main lobby was a cavernous space filled with the smell of mold and something sharper I couldn't identify at first. Perhaps decades of spilled soda and old polish had gone sour and metallic over time. Torn movie posters clung to the walls, their edges curled and discolored. My flashlight revealed glimpses of faces on those posters, some half missing, giving them a grotesque semblance of sorrow. I tried not to linger on those hollowed-out eyes. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each step seeming to reverberate far too long, as if something else in that huge chamber was repeating the sound back at me. I found myself breathing through my mouth, trying to filter out the pungent odor. I carefully made my way past the concessions area, where a broken popcorn machine stood like an abandoned shrine to a forgotten time. The concession counter's glass was cracked, and the floor was littered with plastic cups and candy wrappers that had somehow survived decades without disintegrating completely. I noticed the wide staircase that presumably led to the projection booth, and beyond that to the seats themselves. A sense of anticipation and foreboding pulled me upward. My flashlight illuminated dusty steps and the battered railing. Each creak under my weight made my pulse spike, as if expecting someone to peer around the corner and ask what I was doing. But of course, no one emerged. The building seemed deserted, or so I tried to convince myself. At the top of the stairs, a narrow hallway led to the small projection room. The door stood half ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The stench of chemicals and neglect intensified in that cramped space. I spotted old film reels strewn in a corner next to a metal shelf crowded with half-empty cleaning solution bottles. My heart pounded at the thought of what cinematic treasures or secrets might be on those reels. Though they looked worse for wear, their labels faded and peeling, I kneeled to inspect one reel more closely. It had no clear markings, only a yellowed sticker with indecipherable text. That was when I heard it, a low guttural murmur like someone humming in the next room. The sound rolled beneath the floorboards and walls, vibrating just enough to make the tiny hairs on my arms stand upright. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind outside, or the old air ducts. Still, I felt my chest tighten. I froze in place and listened, forcing my breathing to quiet. The murmur didn't stop. It droned softly, an unintelligible resonance that shouldn't have been there at all. I reasoned that maybe there was a bigger room behind the projection booth, possibly leading to the main auditorium, and the sound could be bouncing around the old acoustics. That explanation seemed to make sense for a moment, so I gathered my courage and backed out of the projection room, walking down another set of steps that led into the balcony area of the auditorium. The seats closest to the upper aisles were half-eaten by time, their cushions slashed open, bits of stuffing strewn about as if torn by some frenzied act of vandalism. Shadows danced over row after row of decaying seats, creating an eerie pattern of emptiness. I decided to move deeper into the theater, creeping along behind the rows, trying not to kick any debris. The further I went, the more I noticed a consistent chill in the air. It wasn't just the usual damp cold of a rundown building. This felt deliberate, like a presence pressing against me. My heart began to pound. My mouth was so dry that I swallowed repeatedly to keep from coughing in the stillness. As I approached the stage, I saw wax drippings forming strange shapes. It took a moment for my brain to decipher what I was looking at. Clearly, candles had been placed there at some point, arranged in a pattern. The wax had melted down in thick rivulets, forming a vague symbol I couldn't recognize. A swirl intersected by jagged lines gave the impression of a stylized eye or perhaps a twisted star. The mere sight made me shiver. There was something purposeful about it, as though an actual ceremony had taken place in front of the screen. I felt an overwhelming urge to leave right then, but my curiosity struggled against my fear. I convinced myself that perhaps local thrill seekers or an amateur occult group had used the abandoned theater for some silly ritual, leaving the melted candles behind. Yet the back of my neck prickled and I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the dark. Suddenly a clanking noise echoed from behind the stage, the unmistakable sound of metal hitting the floor. It reminded me of a steel pipe or a heavy tool being knocked over. My muscles tensed and my flashlight quivered in my grip. I held my breath, waiting to hear footsteps or a voice. Instead, the silence returned, thicker than before. Whatever or whoever had caused that crash was either standing completely still now or had disappeared altogether. I felt a surge of adrenaline and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. Remembering my earlier plan to keep a low profile, I crouched down between the seats, moving as quietly as possible. Torn fabric brushed my legs, and a pungent odor of rot and old sweat assaulted my nose. Every few steps I paused, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, half expecting to catch a glimpse of movement in the aisles or on the stage. My breathing grew shallow, each exhale trembling against my lips. It seemed that the entire building was poised, waiting for something to happen. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, not just watched, but scrutinized. There's a distinct feeling that arises when human eyes are locked onto you. My skin prickled with that unmistakable awareness, prompting a cold sweat to form on my brow. It felt like the theater itself had eyes in every corner. The lingering sense of a hum or murmur still buzzed in my ears, too low to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. Finally, my survival instinct overrode any further need for exploration. I told myself that I had seen enough. The rotting seats, the melted candles, the strange symbol, and that heavy pipe dropping in the darkness. This was more than a simple urban exploration. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't worth risking my sanity. I made a decision to leave before encountering whoever might be lurking backstage. I navigated back through the aisles, nearly tripping several times on loose carpeting and broken seat frames. The looming hush pressed on my eardrums like a weight, amplifying my own ragged breath. By the time I reached the side door, I was practically shaking. My palms were so clammy that I had trouble grasping the doorknob. It took a forceful tug to free the door from its warped frame, and my heartbeat hammered in my chest as I finally stumbled out into the cool night air. I hurried to my car, every instinct in my body screaming that I needed to leave that place. As I fumbled with my keys, jamming them into the lock, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck made me turn my head. With my pulse hammering in my ears, I glanced up at the highest window of the theater, the projection booth window, where the old reels and chemical bottles had been lying in disarray. A faint wavering light swayed back and forth, illuminating the small room from within. It looked like the beam of a flashlight or perhaps a lantern. Someone or something was up there now, rummaging through the same space I had abandoned just minutes earlier. I froze in place, transfixed by that flickering glow. The thought that I had not been alone in the building made my stomach clench with dread, my fingers grew numb, and I almost dropped my keys. The air felt suddenly electric, charged with menace. I remembered the low murmur, the clank of metal, the strange symbol on the stage. Were these mere coincidences or part of something bigger? The questions spiraled, fueling a surge of paranoia. Finally, I unlocked my car and slid behind the wheel, starting the engine with shaking hands. My headlights illuminated the theater's neglected facade for one last moment. It appeared more ominous than ever, like a decaying beast with empty eyes. I couldn't stop staring at that projection booth window, but the swaying light had vanished just as abruptly as it had appeared. I sped off, my tires splashing through puddles on the street, leaving the building behind in the rearview mirror. Yet the memory lingered, taut as a steel wire in my mind. All the way home, I fought the urge to keep checking my mirrors, half convinced I'd spot a shadowed figure in the back seat or a pair of lights trailing me down the dark roads. My rational mind told me it was just adrenaline, that I was letting my imagination run wild after an unnerving experience. Still, the fear felt raw and unshakable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were white-knuckled from gripping the steering wheel. Inside my apartment, I stood in the hallway, shoes still on, trying to steady my breath. My heart rate gradually slowed, but the sense of something amiss persisted. I tried to explain to myself that I had simply spooked myself with old relics and weird acoustics. Yet, every time I closed my eyes, I saw the flicker of that lantern in the projection booth. I heard the indistinct murmur and felt the chill of that place seep into my bones. Over the following days, I caught myself reaching for my phone, tempted to recount my experience to a local historical society or maybe even the police. But what would I say? That I had trespassed into an abandoned theater and heard bizarre noises, that I discovered a half-burned symbol on a derelict stage. Without hard evidence, it would sound like a bad dream or a ghost story told around a campfire. Perhaps it was. Perhaps I wanted it to remain a mystery rather than risk explaining the inexplicable, so I kept quiet. Sometimes when I pass that theater, I see no sign of life, only broken windows and chipped paint. But I know what I experienced in there. My memories are too vivid to deny. I remember the rancid smell, the glint of candle wax congealed into a forbidden shape, the maddening hum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Most of all, I remember that lantern light jerking around in the dark, proof that someone or something had come out of hiding the moment I retreated. To this day, I can't forget the feeling that the cinema itself was more than just a decrepit building. It felt as if I had walked into a trap, a place that thrived on secrecy, resonating with leftover energy from desperate times and unfulfilled dreams. Whether it was merely my mind playing tricks or whether something genuinely sinister dwells there, I'll never be entirely sure. The only certainty is that the memory still haunts me, prowling around the edges of my thoughts, making my skin crawl whenever I recall that dimly lit corridor and the echo of unseen footsteps in the dark. I never went back. Even the idea of setting foot in that theater again makes my stomach flip. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder what might happen if someone else ventured inside. Perhaps they'd discover a simpler explanation. Old pipes, the wind, local pranksters. Or maybe they would confirm my worst suspicions, that the echoing murmurs and flickering lights are only a hint of a deeper, more arcane presence, lurking where no one would ever think to look. The city's once glorious showplace has become a crypt for secrets and specters of the past. And part of me suspects that some nights, if you stand under that high window, you might just see a faint glow dancing in the dark, beckoning you closer before it vanishes without a trace. I first realized something was wrong the very night I moved in. There was a heaviness in the air that no open window could dispel, a lingering weight that pressed against my chest the moment I stepped through the front door. My new home was half of a townhouse, 2 floors, split into 2 separate residences, and I had the front unit all to myself. I was thrilled at first, imagining the convenience of a cozy place near the street, but as soon as I crossed the threshold, I felt inexplicably watched. The overhead light cast strange shadows down the corridor, twisting the shapes of my furniture and boxes into vaguely humanoid silhouettes. The silence in those first minutes was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside, and yet, even in the hush of that evening, I could sense the house breathing around me, as though something invisible were pacing behind the walls. I quickly discovered the attic entrance in the hallway ceiling, a folding ladder that seemed older than the rest of the house, with steps that creaked ominously no matter how cautiously I put my weight on them. The latch that held it closed looked flimsy, so I made a note to fix it soon. It was only after I hauled the last box inside that I noticed the attic hatch was slightly ajar, as if it hadn't been properly shut. At the time, I dismissed it as a minor oversight by the previous occupant, yet a cold shiver ran down my spine when I pulled it down and climbed up for a look. My flashlight's beam revealed a dusty, cramped space with exposed beams and random bits of insulation. Nothing seemed out of place. Still, the chill remained even as I descended. I pushed the ladder back in, turning the latch until it clicked. But that click sounded hollow, unconvincing, like the house was mocking my attempt to secure it. My first night was restless. A dull ache settled behind my eyes, and every slight creak in the wood made me sit bolt upright in bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a subtle thumping sound, followed by a distinct scraping above me, like something hard dragging across the attic floor. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt a sheen of sweat bloom across my forehead. The entire bedroom felt frigid, although the night outside was mild. Before I could muster the courage to investigate, the sound stopped abruptly. I lay there awake until dawn, every muscle tensed waiting for the noise to return. It never did, not that night anyway. Daylight offered a fragile sense of security. I busied myself with unpacking, telling myself that old houses creak and groan, that I was just on edge from sleeping in a strange place. Still, I couldn't ignore a creeping paranoia. The feeling that something was not quite right was almost visceral, like an itch beneath my skin. That afternoon, I decided to climb up again and inspect the attic in full daylight, hoping to confirm nothing was amiss. The moment I tugged on the folding ladder, a draft of icy air rushed past me. I found it odd since the day was warm. Brushing aside the unease, I climbed into the attic. Dust motes floated in the beams of sunlight, and the stale odor of old insulation filled my nostrils. The entire space felt oppressive, as if I'd entered a different realm altogether. I inspected every corner and saw nothing unusual. Still, the sense of being watched was suffocating. My skin prickled, and my breath caught in my throat more than once. Eventually, I tried to fix the latch more securely. I replaced the old latch with a sturdier one, tightening the screws until they wouldn't budge. For a while, that gave me peace of mind. But the second night at exactly 3 a.m., I woke to a loud thud in the hallway. My heart pounded and the blood roared in my ears. I listened, barely breathing, and heard the ladder unfold, step by step, each segment creaking like the groan of a wounded animal. Adrenaline surged through me and I shot out of bed, nearly tripping over the sheets. The hallway light flickered when I switched it on, casting jittery shadows on the walls. Sure enough, the ladder was down, swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. In that moment, a terror I can't fully describe took hold. My skin felt too tight, my heartbeat thundering so loudly I could hardly hear my own thoughts. I stood there for a long minute, trying to decide if I had the nerve to climb those steps. My hands trembled as I gripped the sides of the ladder, and I could feel cold sweat running down my back. The attic hatch gaped like a silent mouth. Stepping onto the first rung, I told myself it was just the old house settling. Maybe an issue with the newly installed latch, but each creak of the ladder jarred my nerves until I thought I might faint from the tension. When I finally hoisted my upper body into the attic, an icy chill wrapped around me. It was far colder than I remembered, and my breath came out in shallow bursts. I swept the flashlight in a slow arc across the darkness. Everything looked the same as before: boxes, dusty beams, cobwebs. But that sense of being watched closed in on me from all sides, as though the very darkness had eyes. Then I heard it, a soft scratch, 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 like claws or nails scraping against the rafters. My stomach lurched and my limbs went rigid. I couldn't move or scream. I just stared into the blackness, struggling to steady my breath. The sound came again, this time from somewhere near the far corner. In my paralyzed state, I recall my mind grasping for rational explanations. Rats, possums, or some other pest. Yet there was an intelligence to the movement, a methodical slowness that made my blood run cold. I braced myself to look, but my body refused to cooperate. The flashlight trembled so badly in my hand that the beam shook violently across the walls. I could feel my knees on the brink of buckling. Then, as abruptly as it started, the scratching stopped. Silence enveloped me, so absolute it roared in my ears. After a few beats of my racing heart, I managed to scramble back down the ladder, nearly tumbling to the floor in my haste. I spent the rest of that night in a state of hypervigilance, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I contacted a contractor to have him check the attic for pests or structural issues. When he arrived, he casually inspected the hatch and told me he couldn't see anything obviously wrong with the new latch. In a calm, almost dismissive tone, he said it was likely just an old spring in the ladder mechanism giving way at night, or a misalignment causing the lock not to hold. He climbed up, took a cursory look around, and concluded there were no signs of infestation, no droppings, no nests, nothing. He mentioned that some attics just get drafty, and that could be the source of the chill. I thanked him, feeling a bit silly, yet the unease remained. I could tell by the look in his eyes that he sensed my anxiety, but I offered no further details. I didn't want to sound unhinged. Over the following days, I tried to ignore the attic as best I could, focusing on my work and daily routines. Still, the nights became a slow torture. I installed a small camera in the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the ladder to descend. Every morning, I'd check the footage, only to find a bizarre gap around the times I'd wake up to the thud. The camera would record right up until about a minute before the ladder dropped, then skip several seconds of footage. Each time it resumed, the ladder was already down. Nothing else appeared on the recording, no figure, no movement. This made my gut twist with dread, as it felt more supernatural than any rational glitch in the equipment. A few days later, I had a brief, strained conversation with my neighbor who occupies the back unit. He mentioned in passing that he rarely heard a peep from my side. When I gently probed about the attic or any strange occurrences, he just shrugged. He admitted the house had some quirks, occasional drafts, odd noises, but nothing out of the ordinary. He gave me a polite nod, and that was it. There was no comforting reassurance, no shared story of bizarre nights. He seemed aloof, as though the house's anomalies didn't affect him in the slightest. That same night, the ladder crashed down again at around 3 a.m. My heart slammed against my ribcage so forcefully that I felt physically ill. Determined not to let fear paralyze me, I forced myself out of bed. My legs shook as I approached the hallway, my breaths ragged in my throat. This time I decided to confront whatever was up there. As I ascended the steps, the temperature dropped dramatically, enveloping me in an almost palpable frost. My teeth chattered, and my lungs felt tight. Each rung creaked under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond the range of my flashlight. Reaching the top, I shone the light across the dusty boards. The beam revealed an unsettling detail I hadn't noticed before. Faint scratches along the wooden beams, in patterns that didn't look random. They spiraled in clusters, almost like runes or symbols etched by clumsy fingers. My breath caught in my throat as I approached them. The marks were shallow but deliberate. A low hiss came from somewhere behind me, sending a jolt of panic through my entire body. Spinning around, I found nothing but darkness. A wave of nausea washed over me as a suffocating sense of dread rooted me in place. I thought I felt something glide past, an impossibly cold current that brushed my arm. My skin prickled, hair standing on end as though electrified by fear. My head swam with the idea that maybe I wasn't alone, that some presence shared this attic with me. Rational thoughts slipped away. The scraping sound returned, emanating from a beam above my head. Lifting the flashlight, I caught a glimpse of movement, impossibly fast, disappearing into the shadows. My mouth went dry and the flashlight trembled in my grip. Every part of me wanted to scream, to run, but my legs locked. Time seemed to slow. My heartbeat was the only constant in the otherwise frozen moment. For an instant, the flashlight flickered. The battery was fresh, so the sudden dimming made no sense. In that faint, stuttering glow, the attic seemed to shift, as if the walls were pulsing or breathing. I smelled something musty and rancid, like wet soil and decaying leaves. My stomach lurched. Then, with terrifying speed, the beam came back to full brightness, illuminating the attic once more. Whatever I'd seen was gone, or hiding just out of sight. I managed to stagger back to the ladder, nearly falling through the hatch in my desperation to escape that claustrophobic darkness. At the bottom, I slammed it shut, twisting the latch until my hand hurt. My entire body was shaking. Cold sweat drenched my forehead and I felt a tingling in my limbs that bordered on numbness. I retreated to the living room and huddled on the couch, not daring to go near my bedroom for fear of hearing those sounds overhead again. It felt like the walls were listening, waiting for me to let my guard down. Sleep became a distant memory. I called out of work the next day, my nerves frayed beyond reason. With the clarity of morning sunlight, I tried to convince myself I'd had a panic attack, that maybe the shapes and sounds were figments of an overworked imagination. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The scratches on the beams, those were real. The camera footage skipping, also real, and my body still ached from the tension of the night before, a raw physical reminder that something had profoundly unsettled me. By late afternoon, I made the decision to gather a few essentials and leave the house for the night. I couldn't endure another confrontation alone. I felt certain that staying after dark would only intensify my dread, and I needed a break from that suffocating fear. As the sun set, the walls seemed to groan in protest, as though they knew I was planning to escape. My heart drummed wildly as I hastily packed a bag. The hallway light flickered again. I thought I caught a glimpse of a shadow near the attic hatch. I refused to look twice, afraid that confirming its presence would break my fragile composure. When I finally stepped outside, the crisp evening air was like a splash of cold water on my face. My breath caught in my throat from relief. I slammed the front door behind me, checking twice to ensure it was locked. Yet even as I turned away, I felt a pull, a sense that the house didn't want me to leave. The windows seemed like vacant eyes, following my every move. My scalp prickled and a disquieting thought flickered in my mind. Perhaps it wasn't just the attic that was haunted. Maybe the entire structure had become a shell for something malevolent. I spent the night in a cheap motel a few miles away, tossing and turning on a stiff mattress. Every gust of wind outside made me jump. I was certain I'd hear the attic ladder crashing down, even though I was miles from that cursed place. By morning, I decided to return, if only to collect more belongings. My plan was to contact someone, a paranormal investigator, if that's what it took. I was done pretending I could handle it on my own. When I entered the house the next day, an icy stillness greeted me. No new footprints in the dust, no obvious signs of intrusion. But the atmosphere felt different, heavier, as though the house had become aware of my intention to abandon it. I braced myself and flipped on the hallway light. Incredibly, the ladder was up and latched, seemingly untouched. My pulse pounded in my neck as I stared at the hatch. Then a sudden electric pop jolted me. The light bulb blew out, casting me into near darkness. For a split second, I was sure I heard a scraping sound above. My body tensed. I almost turned and fled, but something made me pause. I realized I couldn't walk away without facing this one final time. Maybe I needed closure. Maybe I just needed to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy. With trembling hands, I pulled on the ladder's cord, letting it unfold. It creaked ominously as it came down, like an ancient mouth opening to reveal its secrets. A rush of cold air hit my face, and I had to steady myself against the wall. I climbed slowly, step by step, my breath shallow and my skin prickling with goosebumps. The attic was dim, with only a faint light seeping in from small vents near the roof. My heart hammered so violently that I could feel it in my temples. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing the same dusty beams, the same bizarre scratches. But there was no movement this time, no sign of anything lurking in the corners. The air felt thick, laced with an unbearable tension. Then I saw it. Etched into one of the beams was a single fresh scratch, deeper than the rest. It formed a crude arrow shape, pointing toward a spot in the rafters. My stomach twisted in knots as I followed its direction. There, tucked between insulation and wood, was a small hollow. I aimed my flashlight into it and felt my blood turn to ice. Though I couldn't decipher its exact shape, something resided in that alcove. Something that looked wet and twisted, like tangled roots or sinewy branches. I swear it pulsed once, as if sensing the beam of my light. A shock of revulsion surged through me. My legs trembled uncontrollably, and I could feel the burn of tears in my eyes, a mix of terror and overwhelming disgust. In that instant, I realized I needed to leave, that I could never reclaim any sense of normalcy here. Stepping back, I nearly lost my footing on the ladder. The flashlight flickered again, and in the strobing illumination, that shape in the alcove seemed to shift, almost reaching toward me. I bolted, practically jumping the last few rungs. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision tunneling from the adrenaline. Without hesitation, I sprinted to the front door, flung it open, and stumbled onto the sidewalk. I felt the crisp outdoor air on my flushed face and exhaled a shaky breath I had been holding for what felt like hours. A wave of relief and lingering panic washed over me. My only coherent thought was that I needed to get as far away from the house as possible. To this day, the memory of that twisted shape in the rafters haunts me. Even recalling the scraping sounds and the inexplicable chill makes my heart pound and my palms sweat. I don't know if I encountered something supernatural or if my mind finally buckled under the weight of loneliness and fear, but I do know this. As I drove away that final time, the reflection in the rearview mirror seemed darker than usual, like a shadow was lingering in the back seat, following me no matter how fast I went. I'll never forget the feeling of that house watching me leave, and sometimes, late at night, I imagine I can still hear that ladder unfolding in the distance, beckoning me to return to the place where terror waits in the empty darkness above. I felt a chill in my bones before I even noticed the rustling leaves. The wind had a certain hostility that night, a sharpened edge that sliced through my jacket and made every step across the deserted park paths feel like a trespass. For some reason, the streetlights in the distance seemed fainter than usual, as if someone had draped layers of gauze over each bulb, masking their glow. It was late, past my usual hour of returning home, and I had decided to cut through this sprawling park to shave precious minutes off my commute. I immediately sensed that something was off, like a suppressed warning in the air. My heart gave a single hard thud in my chest, a primitive signal that told me I might regret taking the shortcut. I forced myself forward, walking briskly on the winding path. Normally the park felt serene, but that night it seemed forsaken. Even the shadows of the tall trees appeared elongated and almost predatory, as if they stretched in my direction with quiet intent. A few months ago, I heard stories about old drainage tunnels that ran beneath parts of this park, but at the time I dismissed them as mere rumors, urban legends that circulated among locals who liked to scare newcomers. Nevertheless, every so often a friend or colleague would mention hearing strange noises late at night or seeing suspicious figures lurking near the old event center. I had half joked about exploring those drainage systems one day, but had never truly planned to do it. Yet there I was, trudging through the darkness, unconsciously drawn to the area where these rumored passages lay hidden. As I proceeded, I spotted the old event center, an abandoned structure that once hosted community meetings and ceremonies. The building was a monolith of decaying concrete, ringed by faint lamps that flickered like dying fireflies. I remember hearing that the city eventually stopped using it because the foundation had become unstable or mold-ridden. Regardless of the official explanation, the place had an aura of something left behind, stripped of life and purpose. I was nearly past it when I noticed a circular metal hatch near the base of the structure. It was slightly ajar, revealing a shadowed opening beneath. I paused, my pulse quickening. That must be one of the entry points to the drainage tunnels, I thought. The hatch looked old and weathered, with scuffs and rust along its edges. Usually such hatches are locked tight, but tonight it was out of place, almost as if it were beckoning me. I told myself to ignore it, that my apartment was only another 15 minutes away, and that I should leave well enough alone. But an itch of curiosity began clawing at my mind. I rationalized that if the hatch was open, maybe someone else had gone inside. Perhaps city workers were doing maintenance, or maybe it was just left unsealed by accident. My heart pounded again, reminding me that logic often has little hold over irrational impulses. Against my better judgment, I found myself approaching the hatch. Up close, I could see that it had been moved to one side, revealing a short flight of concrete steps leading down. A draft of cold, clammy air emerged from the darkness below, carrying a damp smell of algae and rust. For an instant, I felt an unexplainable tingle on the back of my neck, as if invisible eyes were observing me. I turned around, scanning the empty park. Nothing. It was deserted, or so it seemed. Swallowing the growing lump in my throat, I placed one foot on the top step and descended. The steps opened into a cramped rectangular room that reminded me of a neglected basement. Large pipes crisscrossed the ceiling, some dripping water or condensation. The floor was slick. I had to steady myself against the mossy wall to avoid slipping. The hiss of distant water echoed through the corridor, interspersed with the soft drip-drop of leaking pipes. Each footstep reverberated in a way that made me acutely aware of my own presence, as if I were an intruder in some secret domain. Near the back wall stood a heavy iron door, partially open. It looked ancient, with chipped paint and a brass handle dulled by years of neglect. The door seemed to lead farther underground, perhaps to those drainage tunnels I'd heard about. My mind raced with conflicting urges: turn back or keep exploring. Part of me felt that if I left now, I'd spend the rest of the night haunted by what I might have discovered. Another part of me, the rational side, recognized I was entering territory that had danger written all over it. But in that moment, curiosity prevailed. I nudged the door open and stepped into a larger chamber. Here, the ceiling rose a little higher, supported by old metal beams. Strewn across the floor were remnants of past activity: shattered plastic chairs, dented paint cans, half-ripped sacks of construction materials. A pungent smell of fuel saturated the air. It singed my nostrils like old gasoline that had gone stale yet remained potent enough to spark a disaster. A small part of me realized I should probably cover my mouth or back away, but I was too transfixed, scanning the eerie shadows for any sign of who might have left these items. That's when I heard it. A sudden crash from the far corner of the chamber, loud enough to make me jump. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse hammering in my ears. The noise sounded like a metal drum tipping over. My first instinct was to call out, but no words formed. Instead, I froze, ears straining to detect further movement. An unnerving hiss came next, a low rhythmic exhalation as though gas or compressed air was escaping. The temperature in the room rose suddenly, as if a flame had ignited somewhere out of sight. I felt prickles of heat dancing against my cheeks, while goosebumps erupted along my forearms. There was definitely something burning behind one of those piles of debris, maybe a torch or a small fire. The realization that I was in a confined underground space with flammable chemicals made the back of my neck turn cold. My mind teetered between investigating and fleeing. A primal panic kicked in, telling me that fire plus gasoline equals disaster, and that I had no business staying here another second. With my heart pounding so hard it made my chest ache, I turned to leave, certain I should retreat immediately. I retraced my steps, carefully stepping around broken rubble, and reached the iron door. I peered one last time over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure lurking. The dancing shadows made it look like the darkness itself was pulsing, rippling with malicious intent. My breath hitched in my throat, and I hurried out. As I rushed back through the narrow corridor, the damp smell gave way to an acrid tang that made my mouth dry. My lungs felt constricted, as if the air had thickened. The sense of urgency coursing through me was overpowering. I felt sweat trickle down the sides of my face. Suddenly, the overhead pipes groaned. My entire body tensed, imagining some catastrophic burst of scalding steam. I sped up, nearly losing my footing, and finally saw the concrete steps leading up to the hatch. Relief washed over me for a moment, until I noticed that the round metal cover was no longer askew. It was perfectly shut, with no hint of an opening above. I froze, a rush of dread flooding my veins. I knew I had left it partially open. There was no way it could have resealed itself by chance. Someone had to have come along and deliberately sealed it. My stomach clenched. Who would do that? And more terrifyingly, why? I stared up at the heavy hatch, feeling a wave of claustrophobia pin me in place. Could whoever was in that chamber have circled around and done this to trap me? Or was there someone else above ground, quietly toying with me? My first reaction was to see if it was locked. I climbed the steps and pressed upward on the metal cover. It resisted at first, but shifted with enough force. Relief coursed through me when I realized it wasn't bolted shut. Still, the idea that another person had placed it back was chilling. I pushed my way out into the cold air, my heart galloping so fast it felt in my throat. The night sky looked oddly distorted. The park lamps seemed dimmer than before, their glow feeble against the encroaching darkness. I slid the hatch to one side and nearly tripped over myself to get onto solid ground again. The park remained silent. I paused to catch my breath, the chill biting into my damp skin. I scanned my surroundings. No one was in sight. My ears rang with the echo of my own blood pumping, and I tried to reassure myself that this was just a bizarre random event. Perhaps I had startled a worker in the tunnels, or maybe a group of night prowlers used the space for something illicit and wanted to scare me off. My rational side tried to stitch together a plausible explanation, yet at the back of my mind I felt an itching paranoia that something far more sinister was at play. My entire body trembled, and a faint metallic taste of adrenaline lingered on my tongue. I told myself I had to get away from the event center, away from this park. I glanced back at the hatch one final time. It appeared still closed, unremarkable, but I couldn't shake the sense that if I lingered, it might open again, or worse, someone might emerge. The old building's silhouette loomed like a giant tombstone under the moonlight, swallowing shadows into its gutted interior. Hurrying along the path, I realized how alone I was out there. The trees towered on either side, their branches forming twisted arches overhead. With each crunch of gravel under my feet, I swore I heard a second set of footsteps. I'd whirl around, certain I'd find some silhouette behind me, but each time there was only the empty walkway. My scalp tingled with paranoia, and a rush of heat pulsed at the base of my neck. My breathing grew shallow, and I could feel the dryness in my throat intensify, as if my body were preparing for a fight-or-flight scenario. The more I tried to control my breathing, the more ragged and audible it became. I crossed a small bridge that spanned a decorative pond at the park center, and I couldn't resist looking over the edge. The water was black glass, reflecting the moon in a warped circle, but in my peripheral vision, I swore I saw a pale face ripple on the surface. My mind reeled. Maybe it was just my own reflection, contorted by the water. Still, a sickening jolt passed through me, and I lurched back from the railing. My fingers trembled as I forced myself forward again. As I neared the exit, the path curved by a cluster of tall hedges. Each rustle of the leaves made my stomach lurch with dread. I half expected someone to leap out or something impossible to slither across my path. Adrenaline had me at a fever pitch. My senses felt unnaturally sharp. I detected the faint smell of burnt material on my clothes, probably from that underground chamber, as though the stench clung to me like a malevolent souvenir. A sudden rustling in the bushes made me recoil. I braced myself, eyes wide, only to spot a stray cat dashing away with a hiss. Despite my relief, my heart thundered, and I barely managed to keep from shouting. Eventually, I emerged onto the sidewalk that bordered the park. Streetlights glowed with the comforting orange hue of the city, and the hum of distant traffic felt strangely reassuring. My mind was spinning with questions. Who could have moved that hatch? What was creating that heat and that hiss in the room below? And why did I feel like I wasn't alone down there? More unsettling was the notion that whoever sealed the hatch might be watching me at that very moment from some hidden vantage point. My entire body felt shaky, as if I'd just woken from a vicious nightmare. But this was real. I hurried the rest of the way home, glancing over my shoulder more times than I cared to admit. My building's lobby was a sanctuary of artificial light and bland music playing from a hidden speaker. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the mirrored wall near the elevator. My face was pale, my hair disheveled, and my eyes looked haunted. I nodded faintly to the security guard, who seemed too occupied with his phone to notice my distress. Up in my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, exhaling a trembling breath. I told myself I was safe, but safety did little to quell the electric undercurrent of anxiety that coursed through my veins. Every noise in my apartment, a creak in the ceiling or the hum of the refrigerator, made me jump. I paced the living room, replaying the events in my mind and trying to force some logical perspective. I even considered calling a friend to describe what I'd experienced, but I worried they would either dismiss it as an overreaction or urge me to contact the authorities, which I wasn't sure I wanted to do. I had no evidence, no injuries, and no clear threat, just a deep-rooted sense that something vile lingered underground in that warren of tunnels, and whoever, or whatever, was responsible for it had wanted me out of there in a hurry. Over the next days, paranoia gnawed at me. I walked different routes to and from work, deliberately avoiding the park. The sound of any metal hatch or manhole cover shifting on the street made my skin crawl. I had recurrent nightmares, dark hallways lined with pipes, hissing sounds, and a faceless figure who slipped behind corners whenever I got too close. Each time I'd wake in a cold sweat, the taste of dread sour in my mouth. Sometimes I thought about returning to the park in daylight to see if I could investigate more safely, but some primal part of me balked at the thought. My rational side told me to let sleeping dogs lie. I never found out definitively who or what was down there. Friends asked me why I seemed tense, but I only shrugged and mumbled something about work stress. The truth felt too surreal, too fraught with insinuations I couldn't fully articulate. Every so often I heard secondhand chatter, someone claiming they heard eerie noises at night from the old event center, another person mentioning the smell of fuel near that area. A co-worker once casually remarked that local teenagers like to explore the drainage tunnels, but I never shared my own experience. Even now I can't pass by that section of the park without feeling a shiver of apprehension. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of that metal hatch in the distance, sealed tight as if it has never been moved, yet I know otherwise. I remember the oppressive darkness below, the hiss of burning fuel, and the surge of heat that shouldn't have been there. I recall the deliberate way the hatch had been put back in place, as though warning me that next time I might not be able to force it open so easily. Although I eventually forced my life back into some semblance of normalcy, I've never fully shaken the feeling that I left something unfinished down there. Late at night when sleep won't come, I replay every detail: the crash of the metal drum, the scraping of the pipes, and the wave of warmth against my skin. I wonder what would have happened if I had lingered, if I'd gone deeper into that network of tunnels. Would I have uncovered something unspeakable, or was it all just an unfortunate brush with a mundane but risky situation? The uncertainty claws at my thoughts, a reminder that sometimes the unknown is more terrifying than any tangible threat. And so I go on with my life, a little more vigilant, forever glancing over my shoulder when I pass deserted places. I tell myself I was lucky to get out unscathed, that I'll never poke around in dark, hidden spaces again. But there's a restless corner of my mind that remains fixated on that night, convinced that there was more to discover beyond that iron door, in the labyrinth beneath the old event center. To this day, the memory leaves a bitter aftertaste of dread, as though some piece of me was left behind underground, beneath the sealed hatch, in the silence that most people will never hear. And in that silence, I sense something waiting. A cold draft slipped through the half-open iron gate, carrying with it the stale odor of rust and decaying rubber. I paused just inside the entrance and felt my stomach tighten, as though my instincts were warning me to turn around before it was too late. The industrial district was silent, except for a distant factory hum, yet my senses buzzed with dread. Something about that old bus yard felt profoundly wrong, as if the emptiness itself had a presence, lurking in the shadows, waiting to be noticed. I had arrived early that Sunday afternoon, hoping for a peaceful excursion to satisfy my growing fascination with vintage vehicles. While searching online for anything related to antique buses, I stumbled upon rumors of an abandoned lot situated behind shuttered warehouses. Supposedly there were multiple old buses left to rot there, their glory days all but forgotten. I expected to find little more than broken windows, flat tires, maybe some graffiti. But as soon as I pushed past the heavy iron gate, I sensed a deeper menace that I couldn't quite articulate. Still, curiosity drove me forward. The first row of buses stretched ahead in a mournful lineup, about 10 hulking metal shells, each more corroded than the last. Their paint had long since peeled away, leaving only flaking pockmarked surfaces. Many windows were cracked or missing, giving the impression of hollow eyes. Grass and weeds poked through the asphalt beneath them, further emphasizing how nature was methodically reclaiming what humans had discarded. My heart pounded harder with each step, and a clammy sweat broke out along my temples. Every breath I took carried a mixture of mildew and decades of dust, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. I couldn't tell if it was the wind or my nerves, but I kept feeling tiny bursts of cold air grazing my neck, like a presence hovering just behind me. As I wiped my hands on my jeans, I noticed how unsteady my fingers felt. Even though the sun was still fairly high in the sky, the murkiness inside those buses gave them a cave-like appearance, as if they housed secrets better left undisturbed. Determined to explore, I climbed the steps of the first bus and immediately sensed how stagnant the air felt. The seats, once upholstered with fabric, were torn and discolored, revealing their foam insides. There were old pamphlets scattered around, presumably from when this bus had last been in service. One read City Tour, dated at least 15 years earlier. I saw half-buried soda cans, the logos faded, and a few empty food tins stacked near the back seats. Crumpled sleeping bags and worn blankets hinted that people, likely individuals with nowhere else to go, had made these vehicles their makeshift homes from time to time. A wave of unease struck me as I imagined someone lurking behind the seats, but a quick glance showed no one there. My chest tightened anyway, the persistent feeling of being watched now stronger than ever. The silence pressed in on me, broken only by my own footsteps shuffling through dust. After a few moments, I decided to move to the next bus. As I jumped down and approached the second vehicle, I noticed the gloom was more oppressive. Rust covered the edges of the door, and the tires were deflated to the point that the chassis sank low, giving it a haunted, slouching appearance. I slipped inside cautiously, testing the steps to ensure they didn't collapse under my weight. The interior was damp and smelled vaguely sour, like moldy cloth mixed with something chemical. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the tension in my chest. In the dim light, I saw footprints traced in the dust on the floor. They were not mine. The prints looked recent, definitely more defined than those I had left behind in the first bus. It was as if someone had paced back and forth, their path weaving between the rows of seats. Suddenly, a faint tapping sound emanated from above my head. I froze, pressing my lips together to stifle a gasp. It sounded like footsteps but heavier, carrying a metallic echo. The bus roof creaked under the weight and I felt a chill slide down my spine as the entire metal structure groaned. I couldn't bring myself to move, as if my muscles were momentarily paralyzed by fear. My pulse hammered so intensely that I thought I'd faint. The footsteps continued for several agonizing seconds, then stopped with an abrupt shudder of the roof. A dreadful silence followed. My legs began to tremble. I knew I had to get out of there, but I also didn't want to burst into a frantic run and alert whoever or whatever was up there. My breathing came in shallow, ragged bursts, and sweat trickled along my hairline. When I finally mustered the courage, I eased toward the front of the bus, placing each foot softly to avoid drawing attention. I was mere steps away from the driver's cabin when something large passed along the outside. I glimpsed a tall silhouette, broad shoulders framed by a dark jacket. The figure moved quickly, crossing my line of sight in an instant. My heart stuttered, and a surge of cold adrenaline flashed through my veins. For one terrible moment, I thought it might stop and turn its gaze into the bus, but it vanished among the rows of other vehicles, leaving behind a jolt of terror in its wake. I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to think rationally. Perhaps it was just a local transient seeking shelter, maybe someone who didn't want to be disturbed. That thought offered minimal comfort, but it was better than the alternative that I was sharing this yard with something I couldn't easily explain. Either way, I knew staying put was a mistake. My instincts screamed for me to leave, to get back to my car while I still had the chance. Slipping out of the bus as quietly as possible, I stepped onto the cracked asphalt. The gate was only about 50 yards away, but it felt like an impossible distance. My body was tense, as though I were expecting to feel a hand clamp down on my shoulder at any moment. The sky above had turned dull gray, clouds obscuring the sun and making the entire lot look bleaker than before. Every rustle of wind scraping across debris sounded like movement. I kept swiveling my head, certain I would spot that figure creeping along behind me. As I maneuvered between two more buses, I sensed a strange humming at the edge of my hearing. At first I thought it might be the far-off factory, but it seemed closer, more intimate, like some low vibration inside my skull. My breathing grew ragged again. With each step, it felt as though the yard itself was somehow pressing in on me, urging me to stay. Bile rose in my throat and I swallowed it down, focusing only on placing one foot in front of the other. Then something curious happened. My eyes flicked to the windows of a nearby bus, and I caught sight of a shape staring at me from within. It was a reflection, but not my own. It flickered for less than a second, a white face with dark hollows where the eyes should have been. My chest constricted, and a shiver coursed down my entire body. By the time I looked back, the shape was gone, leaving only the dim reflection of the cloudy sky. The rational part of my mind insisted it was a trick of the light, a swirl of dust, or a shadow from the broken windows. But deep down, I felt a cold certainty that something had indeed been watching me. Panicking, I quickened my pace, practically jogging now. I told myself, don't look back, don't look into any more windows. Whatever you do, keep moving. Yet I couldn't help glancing around as if expecting to see that tall figure behind me or sense that phantom reflection peering from the next bus. My pulse thundered in my ears, matching the frantic rhythm of my footsteps. About halfway to the gate, I heard a dragging sound coming from the side. It was faint, like something heavy scraping across metal. I turned my head reluctantly, and my stomach lurched when I noticed a pair of bus doors shaking. They jolted in their frame as if forcefully pulled from the inside. The glass in the doors rattled, and something pressed against it, a dark palm or perhaps a gloved hand. I couldn't make out any details, only a murky outline, but I froze in horror. The bus interior was black as pitch, and the figure behind the doors seemed to distort the glass with unnatural angles. I forced myself to breathe. My chest felt too tight to allow even a single lungful of air. A nerve in my left leg twitched uncontrollably. Somehow I found the strength to back away and continue toward the gate, sweat streaming down my temples and soaking into my shirt. The sense of being watched turned into a suffocating certainty that multiple eyes were fixed on me from all directions. Everything in that yard seemed alive with silent threat. As I neared the exit, a new flicker of movement startled me. Above me, perched on the roof of a bus, was what looked like that same tall figure. The posture was hunched, reminiscent of a predator preparing to pounce. I couldn't discern facial features, but I could sense its gaze locked on me. My heart hammered so violently I almost felt dizzy. Then the figure tilted its head as if studying me. The tension became overwhelming, and in a burst of frightened instincts, I made a desperate dash for the gates. The pavement blurred under my feet, my lungs burned, and every exhale felt like sandpaper scraping my throat. I tried not to think about how close that figure might be or if it was still crouched on the bus roof above, ready to leap down and snatch me. My veins flooded with adrenaline, fueling my sprint until, at last, I stumbled through the narrow gap in the iron gate. Once outside, I nearly collapsed. I clutched my knees, gulping air. The street in front of the yard was eerily quiet, as if the entire district had gone dormant. Only the distant hum of the factory machines reminded me that I was still in the real world. My legs trembled so badly that I worried they would give out. Although I was now outside that cursed place, the feeling of dread followed me like a lingering shadow. As I made my way back to my car, every clank and hiss from the deserted warehouses set my nerves on edge. A movement at the corner of my vision made me jump, but it was only a plastic bag blowing across the road. I still didn't feel safe, not entirely. Even once I reached the relative security of my vehicle, my hands shook so violently that it took 2 tries to get the key in the ignition. I locked the doors immediately and kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that ominous silhouette sliding into view. Driving away, I couldn't shake the impression that something had attached itself to me, like a stain on my psyche. The reflections I glimpsed in the windows, the footfalls on the bus roof, the sensation of something vile and watchful, these refused to dim. For the rest of that day, my eyes would dart to every shadow in my apartment, seeing shapes in the darkness that weren't there. My mind kept replaying the moment I spotted the figure running between the buses, its form impossibly fast and unnervingly silent. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize the experience. I told myself the old bus yard was simply overrun by vagrants, that the building structures caused echoes and illusions, that my own anxiety conjured hallucinations, yet I couldn't entirely convince myself. Late at night when I lay in bed, I recalled the bus roof groaning under a weight far too heavy for a mere person. I remembered the scraping doors and the black void pressing against the glass shaped like a hand but somehow off. Sometimes I would wake in a cold sweat, convinced I heard metallic footsteps on my ceiling. To this day, I cannot definitively say what I encountered in that abandoned yard. Perhaps it was just a desperate individual trying to scare me away, or maybe something else haunted those buses, some restless entity feeding on fear and isolation. All I know is that every fiber of my being screamed to leave, and I have never set foot back there since. Now whenever I pass through the industrial district, I find myself nervously checking the skyline for those towering bus roofs. Even from a distance, my memory replays that creeping shadow perched on the metal shell, its head is tilted toward me in silent menace. I still feel an unpleasant knot in my stomach, and sometimes my throat goes dry just remembering the sour odor that clung to the air. There are nights when I wonder if I was alone in experiencing those horrors, or if others have ventured there, only to flee in the same abject terror. No matter how much logic I try to apply, the memory remains raw and unsettling. The relentless hush, the creeping silhouettes, the stale breath of the abandoned buses, those impressions linger inside my head like echoes in a cavern. They remind me of how fragile my sense of safety can be, how easily the familiar world can twist into a nightmare. And in my darker moments, I find myself imagining that gate once more, half open and inviting, tempting anyone with curiosity to step inside. Because what truly haunts me isn't just what I saw, it's the realization that something somewhere might still be there waiting for the next unwary soul who dares to cross that threshold. I still remember the night air clinging to my skin like a damp shroud, pressing in on me the moment I set foot on that deserted railroad. The rails had long since rusted into a tarnished red-brown, and the gravel beneath them was partly overgrown by weeds that seemed to twist and reach as if trying to reclaim the tracks for the earth. In the distance, the hulking silhouette of that old brick warehouse rose against a moonless sky, its tall windows glinting faintly with the reflection of distant streetlights. Even before I approached it, there was an unsettling energy that made my hairs prickle on my arms. Everything about that section of the city felt abandoned, yet I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, as though something in the dark recesses of the empty loading bays was tracking every step. I'd walked this route many times before. It had become a personal ritual, an odd habit for when I couldn't sleep. Something about the stillness of the disused railway line calmed me, gave me room to think. The faint echo of my footfalls on the gravel reminded me how alone I was in that moment, but there was another element I craved, a secret desire to feel the brush of danger just beyond my comfort zone. Perhaps that was why I never veered off after reaching the older part of town. Instead, I lingered where the tracks led straight to the massive warehouse with its boarded-up doors and shuttered windows, curious about its silent presence. Locals whispered rumors that it had been condemned or sold off to some faceless company. No one seemed to know for sure, yet in all my wanderings I had never seen it open, never seen a truck come by to load or unload goods. Still, there was something different on that particular night. The humidity was oppressive, the kind that made every breath feel thick. A strange hush blanketed the area, and the chorus of night insects had died down as soon as I neared the building. I couldn't even hear my own breathing clearly at first, as though the atmosphere itself dampened every sound. My heart was starting to beat faster, a dull thud in my chest that seemed louder than my footsteps. I tried to ignore the sensation, chalking it up to nerves, but an indefinable pull, the same one that drew me to walk the old railway in the first place, tugged me closer to the warehouse. I wanted to see what lay within those walls. Perhaps it was simple curiosity, or perhaps it was something far less rational, an almost magnetic compulsion to peer into the unknown. Approaching the side of the building, I noticed an old fire escape bolted to the brick, its metal steps curled with rust. At first I questioned whether it could still support my weight, but my desire to explore was stronger than my caution. Step by step I ascended, each footfall resonating with a high-pitched screech that made my pulse jump. When I got closer to the second-floor window, I realized it wasn't latched properly. The glass was cracked and there was a piece of plywood behind it. With a nervous surge of determination, I maneuvered the window open, ignoring the nails that threatened to snag my jacket. Slipping inside was more disorienting than I expected. I was greeted by darkness so thick it felt like it had substance. My eyes strained to adjust, and for several seconds I stood motionless, unsure of what might be lurking just beyond my field of vision. The only sound was my own breathing, now shallow and ragged, and the faint creak of the floorboards beneath me. As my vision acclimated to the dim interior, I noticed the wooden planks beneath my feet were warped and rotting in places. Each step sent a ripple of sound through the silence, making me hyper-aware of my presence. The walls around me bore splotches of fresh paint, as if someone had tried hastily to cover graffiti. Black shapes of half-hidden words and images peeked through the coat of white or gray, forming ghostly impressions. My pulse quickened every time I caught a glimpse of what looked like a face or a figure scrawled in spray paint beneath the new layer. The warehouse corridor stretched ahead in a labyrinth of vague shapes. If I squinted, I could make out old crates and stacked boxes, some of them bearing faded logos, others wrapped in plastic as though they were new shipments. A stale odor filled the air, part mold, part dust, and something sharper, almost metallic. I remember leaning against the wall to steady myself when I first heard the sounds. There was a faint scraping, like something heavy being dragged across the floor in a distant room. Then came a clang of metal, echoing through the corridor. The sound seized my heart and made me grip the edge of a crate for support. My entire body tensed, and I felt a flush of cold sweat break out on my forehead. There was no question in my mind I was not alone in that building. But the oddest thing was the absence of any human voice or conversation. All I heard was the shuffle, scrape, and drag of materials, occasionally punctuated by what could have been a dull thud. It was as if someone or something was carrying out a methodical task under the cover of darkness. My throat had gone dry, and I inhaled deeply, every breath cutting through the stale air like a ragged blade. Something compelled me to walk further in, a mix of fear and twisted curiosity. My footsteps seemed obnoxiously loud. Each board that creaked under my shoe felt like a betrayal, announcing my presence to whoever or whatever was in the depths of that warehouse. I thought about turning back, forcing myself out the way I came, but the corridor led me to a row of large enclosures, industrial shelves stacked with boxes labeled as beverages. Some of the crates even looked new, with sealed bottles arranged neatly inside. That discovery made my skin prickle. Why was a supposedly abandoned warehouse still receiving goods, and who was dragging materials at this ungodly hour? I ventured deeper, trying to keep my body low and my profile small. The darkness seemed to gain density the farther I moved from the window's faint light. My eyes strained so hard to see that I started imagining shapes flickering at the periphery of my vision. I glanced at the tall windows, hoping for a sliver of moonlight, but the glass was so coated with grime that barely any illumination passed through. Occasionally, I thought I saw a faint glow from deeper in the building, but it vanished the instant I tried to focus on it, as if it were only a trick of my overworked mind. The scraping sounds persisted, accompanied by sporadic clinks of metal. My ears felt hyper-attuned, and each unexpected noise seemed to send a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. My heart was now hammering so hard that I was sure it could be heard echoing through the entire space. At one point, I decided to get a better look at the outside. Carefully, I approached a window to peer down at the railway track below. My breath fogged the grimy glass, and I had to wipe it clean with my sleeve to see. The track looked like a silent, endless ribbon in the darkness, with no sign of life. But just as I was about to step away, a thunderous crash reverberated somewhere close behind me. It sounded like one of the heavy crates had been dropped. I spun around, my knees nearly buckling with anxiety, and pressed my back against the wall. My breathing was ragged, my eyes darting left and right in the dim corridor. I couldn't see anything moving, yet I felt the undeniable sensation of being watched. That primal awareness gnawed at my nerves, sending waves of goosebumps rippling across my flesh. It felt as if invisible eyes were tracing my silhouette, dissecting my every motion. In that pressurized moment, a haunting thought slid into my mind. Maybe what lurked in the darkness wasn't entirely human. The idea was preposterous, but fear has a way of warping reason, making every creak and rustle into a sign of something unimaginable. I tried to dismiss that notion, telling myself it was probably some illicit operation, people storing contraband or something equally mundane, though still dangerous. But there was a distinct weight to the air, like the building itself was charged with a menacing presence. My palms were slick with sweat, and my throat constricted every time I swallowed. It became clear that I had overstepped my curiosity. Determined to leave, I started retracing my steps, trying to remember the path back to the window I'd climbed through. Turning a corner, I saw an open passage leading to a set of metal doors. Beyond them, a faint flicker of light glowed just enough to outline the threshold. For a moment I stood frozen, debating whether to try a direct exit or find my original route. The scraping noise emerged again, louder this time, and I heard a shuffling that made me imagine massive shapes lumbering across the floor. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Without a second thought, I abandoned the idea of investigating further. My only goal was to get out as quickly and quietly as possible. I backtracked through the corridor, each step measured, every breath held. The floors continued to protest under my weight with squeals that made me flinch every time. My mind raced with questions. Who was maintaining this place? Why were there new crates of beverages? What was being dragged around in the middle of the night? And why did it feel so deliberately hidden from sight? My imagination conjured sinister answers, from secret gatherings to bizarre rituals. Every possibility fueled the dread tightening in my chest. When I finally reached the fire escape window, relief washed over me. I slipped through, gripping the rusty railing with trembling fingers. Descending felt like an eternity. Each step produced a metal rattle that shot through me like an electric shock, and I cursed under my breath with every clank of the ladder. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it might leap out of my chest. By the time my feet touched the ground, my legs were shaking. I took a moment to steady myself, inhaling the clammy night air that suddenly felt blissfully fresh compared to the stale darkness inside. That was when I spotted the light near the lateral door of the warehouse. It was a small circular glow like that of a phone's flashlight. It hovered for a second, illuminating a patch of gravel in the base of the building before it abruptly went out. My stomach lurched. Someone or something was definitely there, aware of my presence or at least suspecting it. Instinctively, I ducked behind a mangled stack of discarded rails. The twisted metal formed a crude barrier between me and whatever was at the door. My breathing grew shallow, and I could almost hear my pulse thudding in my ears. The night around me was too quiet, as though even the insects and distant traffic had gone silent to witness what might happen next. I stood there, pressed against the cold metal, counting the seconds. The darkness felt thicker, heavier, as if it might cloak an approaching figure. In that suffocating hush, the tension became almost unbearable. My mind played cruel tricks. I pictured silhouettes creeping around the corner, sensed footsteps that might not have been real. My sweat-soaked shirt clung to my back, and each bead of perspiration felt like an icy droplet sliding down my spine. After what felt like an hour, but was probably less than a minute, I peeked around the edge of the rail. Nothing stirred. The light was still off. No voices spoke. No footsteps sounded. But the warehouse loomed above me, silent and brooding, as though offended that I had dared to enter. I weighed my options. Staying hidden all night was impossible, but every fiber of my being screamed that I should not walk back the way I came. Yet the only alternative involved crossing an open patch of ground where I would be fully visible. Finally, fueled by a surge of desperate courage, I darted out, keeping low. My heart pounded so violently that my chest hurt. I sprinted along the perimeter of the warehouse, away from the side door. Each crunch of gravel under my feet made me cringe, fearing it might alert whoever held that flashlight or whatever else roamed those corridors at night. Reaching the safer edge of the property, I ducked behind a collapsed fence. My breaths came in harsh gasps, and I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to keep quiet. This was not the kind of fear that simply fades when distance is created. It felt deeper, more insidious, like I'd opened a door to something I was never meant to see. Eventually, I gathered myself enough to slip out through a gap in the fence and finally emerged onto a dimly lit side street that connected with the old railroad. Only when I stood among the scattered streetlights did I notice how slick my skin was with sweat, how stiff my muscles felt from being clenched so tight. I walked away as fast as I could without outright running, my ears still straining to catch any sign of pursuit. Every distant car engine or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. Rationally, I told myself the simplest explanation, possibly some clandestine smuggling or an off-the-books storage operation. Yet a gnawing feeling twisted in my gut, telling me the entire place felt wrong on a level beyond ordinary crime. When I closed my eyes, I could still sense the presence I had felt inside, that heavy darkness that hovered near me in the corridor. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down I knew something else had been watching, something I couldn't explain. That night I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I jolted awake to phantom echoes of scraping sounds and a faint metallic clang. My dreams kept turning into half-formed nightmares, with images of the warehouse's labyrinthine corridors stretching into endless shadows. Sometimes I saw flickers of white shapes at the edges of my vision, which vanished the moment I tried to focus on them. I felt a persistent tightness in my chest, a paranoia that someone might have followed me, that the faint glow I'd seen by the door had belonged to eyes rather than a phone. My mind warred with logic, asking whether I'd truly seen those fresh paint marks or if they were illusions conjured by my own panic. In the following days, I found myself avoiding that section of the tracks entirely, choosing different routes to get around town. The urge to return gnawed at me, though. Some part of me wanted closure, to confirm or debunk my suspicions, to peek inside during daylight. But every time I contemplated going back, my stomach twisted in knots, and the memory of that oppressive darkness sent a chill through me. I found myself scanning the news for any mention of the warehouse, some story about a break-in or a police raid, but there was nothing. It was like the building, and whatever transpired inside it, didn't exist in the normal flow of city life. One night, about a week after my encounter, I heard a rumor from a local shop owner that shipments of certain specialty goods had been reported missing from freight trains passing through the old lines. The information lodged in my mind, connecting unsettling dots. My thoughts spun with possibilities. Illicit distribution, stolen goods, or something even stranger. I found no conclusive answers, only more questions. Whenever I pictured those sealed crates in the warehouse, I felt my throat tighten. That tangible proof of activity beneath the veneer of abandonment confirmed that something clandestine was happening, yet the distinct suffocating dread I had experienced in there went far beyond any typical smuggling operation. Even now, my nights remain restless. I'll catch myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a faint circular light flickering outside. If I pause in the right part of town, I can swear I hear the distant echo of metal scraping on concrete, accompanied by the same hush that descended on me that night. And on those rare occasions when my insomnia returns, I still walk the tracks, but never past the point where the warehouse looms. Instead, I veer off onto a side street, hearing my own heartbeat roar in my ears. It's as though I fear the building itself might sense my presence, resentful that I intruded on its secrets. Whether it was a supernatural entity lurking in those corridors, or merely the human darkness of concealed after-hours work, I cannot say. But the memory of those freshly covered graffiti marks, those crates stacked impossibly high, and that scraping noise echoing through the pitch-black halls still keeps me awake. My hands tremble whenever I recall the sight of that solitary flashlight's flicker. I know it wasn't just my imagination. Something or someone noticed me, and I can't shake the notion that one night, if curiosity or foolish courage gets the better of me again, that old warehouse might open its doors to reveal more than stolen supplies. Perhaps it's a shadowed realm of half-glimpsed figures and unspoken menace, where reason dissolves and reality splinters into fear. The possibility burrows into my thoughts, an itch I can't scratch. No matter how many times I tell myself it's nothing, I feel the pulse of dread whenever I pass the outer edges of that neighborhood. In the end, I managed to escape untouched, if not unscathed. But the place left a mark on me, an imprint of its darkness seared into my nerves. Even now, my pulse accelerates when I recall the sound of that dragging and the clang of metal on concrete and that final ominous disappearance of the flashlight beam. I've never found a rational explanation for the way the warehouse seemed to breathe, as if it had a life of its own. Maybe it's only my mind playing tricks, or maybe that building on the old railroad is something else entirely, a silent watcher in the night, waiting for the next intruder foolish enough to seek answers in its depths. From the moment I stepped out of my car, I felt the strange hush that clung to the newly opened shopping mall. It wasn't the usual bustle you expect from a grand opening with bright lights and promotional banners. Instead, there was a muted quality to the air, like a blanket of silence had been draped over the crowds, seeping into the concrete walls and polished floors. My pulse throbbed in my temples as I wandered through the wide corridors, noticing how the fluorescent lights sometimes flickered, as if struggling to stay on. A subtle current of unease slid through my veins, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with this place, something no ribbon-cutting ceremony could gloss over. Little did I know how truly unsettling it would become when I discovered that hidden sub-level. I had come to the mall that day to run a quick errand. It was supposed to be nothing more than a stop on my route, home park, buy a couple of things and leave. But old habits die hard, and my past experience as a wiring installer made me curious about the building's infrastructure. Shopping centers usually have multiple parking levels, some underground, some above ground, and I'd tinkered with enough hidden cable lines in my career to recognize when a place had secrets. My instincts told me there was something below the lowest official parking floor, an extra layer not listed on the elevator panel, and there were rumors, at least from the staff I spoke to in passing, that sometimes they heard odd noises or found out-of-place debris. None of them offered any direct explanation, yet I sensed there was more to it. At first, I only glimpsed evidence that something was amiss. A half-hidden sign behind a maintenance door indicating an additional basement level, though it was covered by peeling stickers reading "No Access" and "Restricted Area." The sign was old. The letters were faded and barely legible. It struck me as odd in such a brand new mall. The corridor leading there was dimmer than the main shopping aisles. Its overhead lights were either turned off or broken. My heart started beating faster just looking at that locked maintenance door. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but a stronger part wanted to investigate. I reasoned with myself that maybe there was a locked sub-basement that only maintenance workers used, or it might be some leftover from the building's construction phase. Yet the feeling in my gut told me this was worth looking into. I took a detour down a deserted hallway near the regular parking area, following the faint smell of mildew that intensified with each step. The odor seemed out of place in a brand new structure, so I kept going until I saw large metal barricades reading "No Entry" in big black letters. They blocked a wide ramp that sloped downward into darkness. Nearby, a cluster of stacked plywood boards partially concealed a small side door, barely noticeable unless you were specifically looking for it. The door looked like it had been hastily painted gray to blend in with the concrete walls, but I spotted the faint outline of its hinges in a gap near the floor. My heart pounded at the thought of exploring it, and I felt my palms grow clammy. Every rational part of me whispered that it was a bad idea, but the curiosity I developed after years of crawling through hidden crawl spaces and pulling cable lines in suspicious places overrode all caution. When I pressed against the small side door, it didn't budge. That only made me more determined. I reached into my pocket for a thin metal pick I still carried, a relic from my old job, and worked it into the latch. My breath caught in my throat. The metal rasped against metal, sounding dangerously loud in the quiet corridor. The lock finally gave way, the door creaked open, and a stale gust of air escaped, thick with mold and something chemical I couldn't name. My stomach lurched. Nevertheless, I slipped through the narrow entrance, closing it behind me as quietly as possible. Inside, a cramped walkway led to the top of the hidden ramp. The lights were off. No emergency bulbs. No faint glow. My phone's flashlight was the only source of illumination. Each step I took down that slope sent a jolt through my body, as if I were descending into a pit of unknown terror. The ramp was long and curved slightly, its walls dripping with condensation. The rhythmic tap-tap of droplets echoed around me, amplified by the concrete. Despite the metallic taste of fear on my tongue, I pressed on. My breathing grew shallow, and my grip on my phone tightened until my knuckles burned. At the bottom, the space opened into a vast underground parking area, or what was left of it. By all appearances, it had never been finished or maintained. The ceiling was lined with exposed pipes and half-installed lighting fixtures. Thick support columns were scattered around, many wrapped in tattered plastic sheets. My light flickered across piles of debris, torn cardboard boxes, twisted metal rods, and random scraps of wood. The smell was worse here, like a mix of damp concrete, old chemicals, and rotting fabric. As I stood there, taking in the scene, the darkness felt crushing, like it was pressing against my eyes and ears. A soft noise made me freeze, the faint tap of dripping water. But it was too steady, too rhythmic. It sounded more like a deliberate metallic knock than simple water droplets. My heart jack hammered in my chest, each pulse of blood reverberating in my ears. I swept the beam of light across the floor and glimpsed faint tire tracks in the dust, as though some vehicle had been driven around this hidden level recently. There were also dark stains on the concrete, oil perhaps, or something else. I crouched down to touch one of the spots with my finger and found it still slightly slick. In the distance, behind a row of support columns, I saw scattered sacks with suspicious white powder leaking from the corners. The lumps of powder looked so stark against the gray floor, and an acrid chemical odor made me step back. Suddenly, a flicker of motion in my peripheral vision jolted me. I jerked my phone's flashlight to the left and saw nothing but columns and debris. My throat felt tight, my skin turned clammy. A wave of nausea passed through me as I realized I wasn't alone. The silence shifted, like the hush just before a predator strikes. I forced myself forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. My legs trembled, threatening to give out. The more I advanced, the more I became convinced that someone or something was watching. Rounding one of the pillars, I noticed a piece of bright yellow tape stretched between two columns. The tape was spattered with black markings, and my phone's light revealed words printed repeatedly on it, something akin to authorized personnel only. This must have been the boundary for a sealed-off section. Beyond the tape, the shadows seemed even thicker, almost tangible. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt dense and stifling. I inched closer to the tape, and that's when I saw it, a hunched silhouette near the far wall, barely discernible yet undeniably there. It appeared to be leaning against the concrete, as if waiting. A surge of terror pounded in my chest, and I instinctively pointed my phone's flashlight straight at it. The moment the beam landed on the spot, the figure vanished. The wall was empty, the shadows playing tricks on my vision. My lungs seized, and the ache in my chest told me I'd been holding my breath. Did I imagine it? A cold sweat soaked my shirt as I willed myself to remain calm. I rationalized that maybe my eyes were adjusting to the darkness, that stress and fear were conjuring phantoms. Still, I couldn't banish the dread that pulsed in my veins. I scanned the area again, and in the far corner, I caught a glimpse of movement. It was low to the ground, as if someone or something was crouching behind a stack of old crates. A scuffling sound echoed across the concrete floor, followed by a dull thud. My breath hitched, and I felt every hair on my body stand on end. Adrenaline surged, and I fought the urge to run immediately. Some reckless part of me wanted to see who, if anyone, was there. Perhaps it was just a maintenance worker or a security guard. Maybe someone else had discovered this hidden place, yet something in my gut warned me it was more sinister. Creeping closer, I could almost see around the crates. My phone's flashlight revealed deep scratch marks gouged into the metal frames of the boxes, as if someone had dragged them forcibly or used them to conceal something. I tried to angle my phone to illuminate behind the crates, but my hand shook too badly to keep the beam steady. And then in that quivering glow, I caught a split-second glimpse of a pale face, eyes that reflected light back at me, wide and unblinking. My entire body iced over, and I stumbled backward. The face disappeared, but I'd seen enough to know it was no trick of the mind. My heart hammered so violently I could feel it rattling my ribs. The corners of my vision began to blur with panic. My breathing turned ragged, lungs desperate for air that seemed tainted with something foul. I stumbled away from the crates, adrenaline forcing my legs to move even as my mind reeled. The tapping sound resumed, louder now, echoing in the emptiness like a twisted heartbeat. The pitch of it seemed to shift, almost forming a pattern that hinted at some intelligence behind it. My thoughts raced with questions. Who was that? What were they doing here? Were they even human? And what was that powder in the sacks? I felt claustrophobic despite the vastness of the space. Every column became a potential hiding spot, every pile of debris a trap. The darkness seemed alive, pulsating with threats I couldn't see. At one point, I thought I sensed a presence directly behind me, an intangible pressure on my shoulder blades. I whipped around, phone held high, half expecting to see a figure towering over me. Nothing. The emptiness mocked me, but my instincts refused to let me relax. By then, the primal urge to escape was impossible to deny. My mouth was dry as sand, and my calves already ached from tensing with each step. I turned toward the ramp, though I wasn't entirely sure I remembered how to get back. My phone battery was draining fast from the flashlight, and the horrifying thought of being down there with no light at all spurred me to move faster. I navigated between the columns, scanning frantically for the small walkway that led to the side door. Dread churned in my stomach, as though something might leap out at any second. That feeling of being watched intensified. My scalp prickled and cold perspiration trickled down my spine. Somewhere behind me, a metal object clattered to the floor, the sound reverberating through the empty sublevel. My nerves felt like they were on fire. Fighting the impulse to panic completely, I strained my eyes in search of the exit. Finally, I spotted the slope of the ramp in the distance, partially hidden behind a stack of old pallets. The mere sight of that upward path filled me with desperate hope. I bolted toward it, shoes scraping against the concrete, breath ragged and hard hammering. My muscles burned and my fingers trembled around the phone. I no longer cared about stealth, I only wanted out. The entire space seemed to protest my presence as if the walls themselves were pushing me away. My footsteps seemed louder than any noise I'd made before. Each echo carried my panic. When I reached the foot of the ramp, I dared one last glance over my shoulder. In the dim glow of the flashlight, I swore I saw a figure standing in the center of the basement, motionless as a statue. Then the shape receded into darkness. Or maybe my mind simply couldn't register it anymore. Scrambling up the ramp, I barely managed to wedge open the side door. Fresh air never tasted so good, even though it was stale from the confined corridor on the other side. I slipped back into the hallway near the official parking area, my heart still thudding against my ribs. I quietly closed the door behind me, carefully relatching it. My breath came in hard gasps, and my body trembled uncontrollably. The fear hadn't subsided, not by a long shot, but the relative safety of the lit corridor offered some relief. I hurried to my car, adrenaline still coursing through me, every step an exercise in not breaking into a frantic run. When I finally sank into the driver's seat, I locked the doors and exhaled shakily. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and it took me a moment to steady myself enough to start the engine. I left that parking structure as fast as I could without drawing attention. The bizarre images of that hidden level were looping in my mind. Later, I tried to glean more information from someone who worked there, a maintenance man I'd seen around the mall. He spoke under hushed tones, telling me that employees had occasionally mentioned odd noises and rumored they'd found strange sacks of unknown powder in the locked areas. Some believed it was a leftover construction site used for illicit activities. Others hinted at something more unsettling, though no one was brave enough to investigate thoroughly. The man said he had heard all sorts of unsettling sounds, but was warned never to go down there. He didn't elaborate, instead he simply shrugged, and his eyes showed the same unease I felt deep in my bones. Days turned into weeks, and the memories of that sublevel still plagued me. Every time I closed my eyes, I would picture those dark columns and that half-seen figure behind the crates. My heart would pound in my ears, and my body would tense as if ready to bolt again. My sleep was fitful. I'd jolt awake, covered in cold sweat, convinced I'd heard the rhythmic tapping echoing in my bedroom. Over time, I began to question my own perceptions. Had I really seen a face? Or was it some pattern of shadows across the crate? Was that silhouette just a trick of my exhausted mind? And yet I couldn't shake the conviction that something real was down there, someone or something hidden away in that forsaken parking level. The thought of it being mundane criminals doing shady dealings was almost comforting compared to the inexplicable dread that had gripped me. If it was just criminals, why had I felt that overwhelming sense of being watched in an impossible way? Why had the air seemed so thick with malevolence, as though the darkness itself were alive? The answers never came. I avoided that mall entirely after that day. Even driving by, it sent a shiver through my body, and I found myself taking a longer route home to avoid the building altogether. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering if any of the shoppers unknowingly strolled over that sealed ramp, oblivious to what lay beneath. I'd remember the heavy chemical odor, the sacks of mysterious powder, the hidden maintenance signs, and that unnatural, unceasing dripping noise that sounded so deliberate. I could still feel the creeping sensation of something at my back whenever I recalled the hallway leading to that locked door. To this day, the memory provokes a prickling terror that no amount of logic can dispel. I've tried to convince myself it was only a dark basement with suspicious debris, perhaps used by unscrupulous people for activities best left unnamed. But there's a corner of my mind that won't let it rest, a dark whisper that reminds me of that face, those eyes that flashed in the beam of my phone's flashlight. The recollection twists my stomach into knots and makes my skin crawl. No matter how I try to rationalize it, I'm left with a lingering dread. It is the type of fear that gnaws at the edges of your consciousness, surfacing when you least expect it, reminding you of the thin line between the ordinary and the unknown. I escaped that hidden sublevel physically unharmed, but it left a mark on me, a heavy, persistent dread I can't quite shake. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part, walking away yet never really leaving that subterranean maze behind. Because even though I made it out alive, a piece of me remains trapped down there in the darkness, haunted by the echo of that relentless metallic knocking and the fleeting half-glimpsed shape that still lurks just out of sight. The sky hung low and gray, a suffocating canopy that pressed down on the rolling pastures and the faded wooden farmhouse perched at the top of a lonely hill. Even from a distance, I felt it staring back at me, a silent witness to countless secrets lost in time. The wind carried a strange scent, damp earth and decaying timber, almost as if the very bones of that ancient structure were exhaling centuries of stories, none of them comforting. My heart pounded, caught between a familiar curiosity and unfamiliar dread, and I knew, even before stepping foot on that land, that I was crossing an invisible threshold. I had been running these rural roads every weekend for months, and that neglected farmhouse had become an almost obsessive landmark in my mind. At first I found it picturesque, like something out of an old photograph, a large wooden house with peeling paint, leaning slightly as though it could collapse under its own weight at any moment. But each Sunday as I ran by, I caught myself slowing down. My eyes would linger on that place, tracing its sagging roof and gaping windows. The more I looked, the more it seemed to call to me, fueling a restless curiosity that I couldn't quite explain. One weekend I decided I had to see it up close. Running past it was no longer enough. Some deep, nagging feeling told me there was more to discover. So I broke my own routine. I woke up earlier than usual, hopped in my car, and took the winding dirt road that snaked its way up the hill. As I ascended, the muddy tracks carved into the ground hinted that I wasn't the first to venture there recently, though this road appeared long neglected. The hills stretched out in every direction, green but eerily empty, no cattle, no fences in decent repair, just a quiet sense of abandonment. When I reached the top, I parked near what looked like an old corral, its wooden planks rotting and broken. The boards were bleached by the sun, and a few stood upright like jagged tombstones. My hands clenched the steering wheel for a moment before I forced myself to step out. Immediately the breeze carried a damp chill, raising goosebumps on my arms. I had expected the air to be fresh, but there was a stale quality to it, as if something lingered in the atmosphere that did not belong. The driveway was overgrown, yet I noticed deep tire marks in the mud close to the gate. That unnerved me. It was clear someone else had been here, and not too long ago. The farmhouse dominated the scene, large, imposing, and silent. Every step I took toward it seemed amplified. My boots sank slightly into wet earth, producing a suction-like noise that made me cringe. The closer I got, the more I felt a tightening in my chest, as if the house itself was drawing the air from my lungs. I could see right into the empty windows, no glass, just hollow openings that seemed to watch me approach. I circled around to the back where a door hung crookedly on rusted hinges. The door frame was warped, so it wouldn't have closed properly even if someone tried. When I placed a hand on the door, I felt a sudden pulse of anxiety race up my spine. The wood felt damp, rough under my fingertips, a grim reminder of how much time had passed since anyone maintained this place. I pushed it gently and it gave way without resistance, opening into a cramped back area, perhaps once a storage room. Dust motes swirled in a stale beam of light as I stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath my weight. My breath caught in my throat. The interior was dim, musty, and filled with the faint stench of mold. Sheets of spiderwebs clung to every surface. I noticed an ancient chair tipped over in one corner, its seat torn. A tarnished mirror lay face down on a wooden table. My skin prickled at the thought of what its reflection might reveal if I dared to pick it up. With cautious steps, I ventured deeper, passing into a main hallway that connected several rooms. A wave of claustrophobia hit me, as if the walls themselves were pressing in. There was something oppressive about the silence here, broken only by the distant groan of old wood. The atmosphere felt thick, almost alive, as though it were a presence itself rather than a simple lack of sound. I recalled a conversation with a friend who had once mentioned an old farmhouse up on a hill that people whispered about. He had dismissed the rumors as local folklore, stories about strange sightings and unexplained lights in the windows late at night. I remembered him shaking his head, describing how a caretaker supposedly visited from time to time, though nobody really knew why. He insisted it was probably just someone checking on the property, but now I wondered if there was more truth to those rumors than he cared to admit. Moving forward, I saw that the corridor led to a series of bedrooms. The doors were mostly shut, but one was slightly ajar. As I approached, an inexplicable pressure formed around my temples. My pulse throbbed in my ears and I felt my stomach tighten. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave this place, and never look back. Yet I pushed the door open anyway, my fingertips trembling against the worn wood. Inside, the room was nearly bare. A single wooden chair in one corner, dust-caked floorboards, and an old lamp, a rusty oil lamp, sitting on the ground near the far wall. Next to the lamp lay a thick, hardcover notebook. Its edges were warped with moisture, one side drenched, as though it had been dropped in a puddle. The lamp looked strangely out of place, as if someone had been here not too long ago trying to read or write in the failing light. I knelt down to pick up the notebook, my heart hammering against my ribcage. It felt cold in my hands, and water dripped from one corner. Carefully, I flipped it open, struggling to make sense of the faint scribbles on the warped pages. Some of the text was faded beyond recognition, but a few entries appeared more recent. There was fresh ink that had not fully dried, smudging slightly when I ran my thumb across it. I couldn't decipher the handwriting. It seemed frantic, with words scratched out, annotations scribbled in the margins. A single phrase jumped out at me, but I only caught fragments. Watching. Night. Don't look back. My breath quickened. The sense of unease ballooned in my chest. A sudden chill swept over the room, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in an instant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a presence behind me so intense that every muscle in my body tensed. The metallic taste of adrenaline filled my mouth, and my scalp prickled with the certainty that I was no longer alone. Without thinking, I jerked my head around, searching for the intruder. No one was there. Yet the oppressive feeling refused to leave, clinging to me like a second skin. I rose to my feet, the notebook clutched tightly in my hand. My hand shook so badly that the pages fluttered. For a moment I stood there, paralyzed, trying to rationalize what I was experiencing. Maybe the wind had come through a broken window. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. But every fiber of my being screamed that someone or something was watching me. Suddenly, I heard a soft rustling from somewhere in the house. It sounded like footsteps across an old rug or the brush of cloth against wood. My breathing grew ragged, my chest tightened. The lamp in the corner flickered, even though there was no visible flame. It was as if the shadows themselves had stirred. I remembered stories of places haunted not by ghosts, but by the echoes of strong emotions: grief, anger, obsession. Here, it felt as though all those emotions were swirling around me in a suffocating dance. I decided I'd had enough. My curiosity had turned to dread. My initial determination to explore was replaced by a primal urge to flee. Clutching the notebook against my side, I stepped backward into the hallway. The air outside the room seemed heavier, and the corridor's dimness felt like a tunnel with no end. I heard a sound behind one of the closed doors, a soft creak, then silence. I didn't wait to find out what caused it. My footsteps echoed as I made my way back toward the rear entrance, each board groaning in protest beneath me. Once outside, I gulped the cold air in heaving breaths, my lungs burning as if I had just sprinted up a steep hill. I looked around, half expecting to see another person, or perhaps a figure lurking in the yard. Only the twisted remains of the old corral greeted me, and the pale sky overhead offered no comfort. I hurried toward my car, my fingers shaking so violently that I struggled to fit the key into the ignition. When the engine finally turned over, I reversed quickly, churning the mud beneath my tires in my haste. As I drove down the slope, I noticed again those deep tire marks near the gate, fresh enough that puddles hadn't yet filled them with water. My own tracks were partly overlapping with another set that seemed to vanish into the distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever left those tracks was still nearby or might return at any moment. Even after I returned home, my thoughts remained tangled with the memory of that presence. The scribbled words in the notebook haunted me. I tried to recall more phrases, but my mind kept going back to that single notion of being watched. I spent a sleepless night replaying the experience in my head. Every creak in my own house made me jolt awake. my skin clammy with sweat. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I tried to convince myself it was all just an overreaction. In the following days, I wrestled with whether to go back. Part of me needed to know what was really happening in that farmhouse, who was visiting it, and what those writings meant. Another part of me, the logical, self-preserving part, warned me to stay away. I imagined confronting a caretaker or some stranger with a mundane explanation. Maybe they were restoring the property or checking for weather damage, but the memory of that intangible presence made that scenario seem too simple, too ordinary. I confided in a colleague, speaking indirectly about my unsettling experience. He joked that I must be describing an urban legend in the making, adding that there were stories of old farmhouses all over the country where odd things took place. When I told him about the tire tracks and the notebook, he became more serious, quietly suggesting that it might be best not to meddle. There was no direct warning, but I detected an undercurrent of concern in his voice. Despite his caution, my mind refused to let it go. I woke up every day with a fresh urge to drive back up that hill, to search the place inch by inch for answers. Late at night, my thoughts drifted back to the lamp on the floor, the wet pages, and that ominous feeling of not being alone. My reflection in the mirror each morning showed dark circles under my eyes, evidence of my restless nights. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I had truly felt something or merely spooked myself in a derelict building. Eventually, I decided to return, at least to the base of the hill, if only to observe from a distance. I planned to go at dusk, thinking that the fading light might reveal whatever was happening under the cover of twilight. But when the time came and I parked at a safe vantage point, I felt my stomach churn with anxiety. The silhouette of that farmhouse was etched against the sky, an ominous outline that seemed ready to swallow all light. I waited there for nearly an hour, my heart thudding in my chest, scanning every window for movement. I saw nothing, yet I could feel the tension coiling in my muscles. The emptiness was, in its own way, worse than spotting someone prowling around. Finally, I decided that I couldn't bear the thickening darkness any longer. I left, feeling an overwhelming sense of failure and relief all at once. I tried to console myself with the idea that perhaps my initial encounter had been enough proof that something about that place wasn't right. After all, I had the memory of the notebook, the disturbing phrases, and the knowledge that fresh tire tracks indicated recent activity. There was no question that I hadn't imagined at all. The most unsettling part, however, came a few nights later. I was lying in bed, half awake, when I swore I heard the distant rumble of an engine passing by my window, a slow and labored sound that reminded me of an old truck climbing an incline. My heart pounded as I listened, but the noise faded away before I could be certain of its origin. I couldn't help imagining someone driving to that abandoned house in the dead of night, lamp in hand, continuing whatever they had been doing all along. Even now, recalling the silent rooms and that open doorway sends a shudder through my body. The sense of being watched has never quite left me. Sometimes during my morning runs, I'll glance up at the hill and catch a flicker of movement, or maybe just a reflection of the sun on the farmhouse's broken windows. Each time, a cold sweat breaks out across my forehead and I feel the echo of that presence coursing through my veins. I haven't returned to the farmhouse. The questions remain, plaguing me like a fever dream. Who leaves those fresh tire tracks? Why does the notebook contain recent writing in a place so clearly abandoned? And what was that suffocating presence behind me in the room? Part of me wants to believe there's a perfectly logical explanation, that the caretaker I once heard rumors about really does visit occasionally, perhaps journaling repairs or inventory. But another part of me, the part that remembers that freezing chill and the oppressive silence, knows it's something far more disturbing. I can still picture the warped floors, the rain-damaged walls, and that lonely lamp on the ground, flickering without a visible flame. The memory clings to my psyche like a shadow that grows longer with each passing day, reinforcing an unshakable feeling that I escaped before uncovering something truly sinister. Each time I consider the farmhouse, my pulse quickens, and I catch myself checking my rearview mirror, half convinced I'll see headlights trailing me, creeping closer in the darkness. Some nights when I close my eyes, I see the notebook's pages, the ink glistening under a faint glow, taunting me with secrets I'll never fully decipher. I sensed that if I dared read every word in that journal, I would find truths that could twist my understanding of reality. Yet fear holds me back, reminding me that some doors are better left unopened. There are places that call to our darkest curiosities and then refuse to let us go, even after we flee. That old farmhouse on the hill is one such place. I feel its pull every weekend, a silent invitation that promises only one thing: once you look into its hollow eyes, you can never unsee the darkness behind them. And so I continue my runs, always passing by at a safe distance, trying not to look too long, trying to convince myself that what I felt was just my imagination. But deep down I know I'll never be the same. No one goes up there anymore, except perhaps whoever left those fresh tire marks. And maybe, just maybe, whatever's inside that house is waiting, watching, and recording every moment, hoping I'll return for answers best left alone. I first realized something was wrong the moment I set foot in that corridor, long, narrow, and cloaked in a gloom that felt almost alive. Even during the daytime, the overhead fixtures cast feeble lights, throwing bizarre shadows against walls stained by decades of quiet neglect. The air smelled stale, like it had been trapped and recycled too many times, carrying whispers of something I couldn't name. My heart pounded with a strange, inexplicable apprehension, and my breathing grew shallow. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that the anxiety stemmed from moving into an old building, yet a suffocating unease clung to my skin. It was as though the place itself was warning me, this isn't just another apartment, turn back while you still can. I wish I'd listened to that first instinct. When my uncle left me this apartment in a wealthy but aging neighborhood, I thought I'd struck gold. After all, it was a chance to save on rent and live in a location that, under normal circumstances, I'd never afford. It didn't bother me that the building looked like it belonged to another era. Its exterior featured weathered stone, intricate iron railings on balconies, and a foyer with an antique mosaic floor. I thought it looked charming. Even the musty smell in the lobby and the faint flicker of the old chandelier felt quaint, like stepping into a time capsule of a more elegant age. At first, everything seemed perfectly manageable. The neighbors were distant but polite. The piping rattled occasionally, and the ancient elevator shuddered and groaned but never failed. For a while I slept easily, and I chalked up every creak or echo to the building's character. Things changed, however, in subtle steps. I started waking in the middle of the night to the sound of the doorbell. My chest would tighten, and I'd feel my heart battering my ribs. Each ring was sharp, invasive, and relentless. Ding dong, like a persistent visitor with urgent business. My first reaction was annoyance. Who rings the bell at 3 a.m.? I'd stumble out of bed, cross the hallway, open the door to find no one waiting. The corridor lights would flicker, revealing only the stale, oppressive emptiness. No footsteps, no hushed whispers, just silence. I'd close the door, try to calm my racing pulse, and return to bed. It kept happening, night after night. Always the same pattern. The bell would ring. I'd open the door to an empty corridor, and I'd be left trembling in the threshold, scanning for any sign of movement. I became convinced that some prankster was lurking in the hallway, so I did the only thing I could think of. I shut off power to the doorbell circuit at the fuse box. I flipped the switch, tested it, confirmed the bell went silent, then collapsed into bed with a satisfied sigh. That sense of relief didn't last. Around 4 in the morning, the ringing started again. It was clear as day, echoing through the apartment, drilling into my skull and constricting my throat in pure terror. There was no electricity flowing to that doorbell, yet it rang. I felt my breath hitch, sweat breaking out on my temples, and my fingertips going ice cold. When I opened the door this time, my heart thrashed in my chest so violently I thought I would pass out. Once again, nothing. The hallway was absolutely empty, accompanied only by the quiet hum of the old overhead lamp. My nerves were shot. I found myself bracing for nightfall each evening, my stomach in knots, and my body tense as though expecting a physical attack. I would think twice before turning out the lights, and I started running on caffeine and fear. One early morning, after one of these phantom rings, I stumbled back to my room. That's when I began hearing a faint tapping sound near the built-in closet. It was an irregular pattern, soft, insistent knocks coming from inside the wall. The closet itself was made of old, dark wood, and the shadows in there always seemed too deep, as if the light didn't dare to penetrate. I tried pressing my ear to the wall, and a wave of cold dread swept through me. The tapping paused, then resumed, as if acknowledging my presence. My pulse hammered in my throat, and I found myself backing away before I could even think about it. I crawled back into bed, adrenaline surging, my eyes fixed on the closet door. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Over the next few days, my growing paranoia made me question every minute detail of the apartment's interior. Every scuff on the floor looked suspicious. Every creak in the ceiling had me jolting upright. Every reflection in the windows seemed to flicker with movement. I could feel my heart drumming every time I passed in front of that closet. It was as if something pressed against the wooden panels from the inside, aching to come out, demanding attention. I started rummaging through old boxes left by my uncle, hoping to find some explanation, maybe old documents, newspapers, or even a diary that could shed light on what might be happening. My mouth would go dry as I searched. My fingers trembled and my stomach roiled. All I found were miscellaneous receipts, photographs of unknown people, and a few scraps of writing that seemed unrelated. Sleep became a battlefield. I'd drift off only to snap awake an hour later, convinced the doorbell had chimed or that the tapping had started up again. My sweat-drenched sheets would cling to me, and my heart would sprint so fast that I wondered if it would ever slow down. My reflection in the bathroom mirror began to show dark circles under bloodshot eyes, and I felt jumpy at the slightest sound. I even spoke briefly with the doorman about mysterious noises, telling him I'd heard odd rings at night. He shrugged and mentioned indirectly that the building had its quirks. The unspoken message was that no one else seemed to care or notice. I left that conversation feeling more alone than ever. In an attempt to restore order to my life, I developed nightly rituals, checking the doorbell fuse, double locking the door, placing towels at the base of the closet so I wouldn't hear the tapping so clearly. I also tried reasoning with myself, telling myself that old electrical wiring can malfunction, or that maybe water pipes behind the walls were responsible for the knocks, but the illusions, if they were illusions at all, grew more elaborate. One night as I tiptoed down the hallway, I swore I saw the closet door slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat and I felt a clammy wave of cold rush over me. When I lunged forward to push it closed, it was locked tight, just as always. My fingers shook for minutes afterward, the sensation of near panic coursing through every muscle. Adding to my confusion, the doorbell started chiming at unpredictable hours, late afternoons, just after sunrise, times when I was wide awake. I'd rushed to peer through the peephole, sweaty palms sliding on the doorknob, only to find the corridor empty again. One particular morning, the bell echoed while I was in the shower. Hurriedly turning off the water, I stepped out, goosebumps forming on my arms. The ring cut through the quiet, sending a jolt that nearly made me slip on the tiles. With a towel hastily wrapped around my waist, I flung open the door. No one stood there. My breathing was so loud in my ears that it took a moment to realize the old overhead light in the corridor wasn't even on. The gloom made the walls look elongated, as if the corridor stretched endlessly. That disorientation gave me a wave of vertigo, and I stepped back, feeling disoriented, with my heart racing uncontrollably. As the disturbances intensified, my mind started playing tricks on me. I found myself second-guessing everything: the stability of the building, the history behind this place, and whether I was truly alone in the apartment. One afternoon, I detected a thin scratch on the closet door. I couldn't recall seeing it before, and it looked fresh, as if something had scraped the wood from the inside. My hand trembled as I traced the groove, with a tightening of panic in my chest. Was the wood expanding with the humidity, or had I simply missed it? That same evening as I lay down, I could have sworn I heard faint whispers. Nothing distinct, just the hush of something speaking too low to fully register. My heart hammered violently in my chest, and I felt my hands turn clammy. Even with all the lights on, every corner seemed to flicker with hidden shapes. Determined to confront whatever was toying with me, I decided to investigate the space behind the closet. My uncle's records indicated that there was a small service cavity there for wiring, though it was rarely used. Mustering every ounce of courage, I pried open the back panel of the closet. Dust motes swirled in the stale air, and the darkness beyond the opening was nearly impenetrable. A rancid, decaying odor wafted out, and I gagged, my throat convulsing. My skin erupted in goosebumps as I forced myself to peek inside. I found a cramped, narrow space with old wiring, cobwebs, and piles of rotted cardboard. No sign of anything or anyone. But even as I craned my neck to see deeper, I heard a soft hiss, like a draft winding through a tight gap. The sound vibrated in my ears with a sinister, wordless menace. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me, and I jerked back, my heart a wild drumbeat in my chest. That night, the tapping escalated into a scratching. It wasn't continuous. It came in short bursts that seemed to travel along the wall behind the bed, down toward the closet and back again. I imagined some creature scuttling in that service space, but the thought didn't fully align with what I was hearing. It sounded deliberate. I shoved my pillow over my head, trembling from scalp to toes, but there was no drowning it out. My eyes watered from stress, and my breath came in shaky gasps. The hours dragged until daybreak, when the scratching ceased. I reached a breaking point the following evening. My nerves were so frayed that I could barely keep it together at work during the day, and by the time I got home, my entire body felt jittery, like I was constantly bracing for a thunderclap. I resolved to stay awake until the doorbell chimed, or the tapping began, determined to catch whatever was responsible. The apartment was dead silent, except for my own pounding pulse. Midnight came, then 1 in the morning. My eyelids drooped, but I forced them open. At 2 o'clock, I felt my heart lurch. The doorbell rang. Ding dong, even expecting it didn't lessen the terror. My vision tunneled and my lungs felt starved for air. I staggered to the door, threw it open in one motion. Empty corridor as always, but this time I thought I saw movement at the far end, just a shifting of a shadow. The overhead light flickered, and for a fraction of a second I felt certain that someone or something stood there. My whole body turned ice cold and I nearly collapsed from the rush of fear. Then the corridor fell back into stillness. I stumbled to the bedroom only to hear the tapping instantly. This time it was more like a pounding, forceful and demanding. My pulse roared in my ears, and panic seized my muscles. The walls felt too close. Everything seemed to press down on me. The sound reverberated through the space, sending shockwaves of alarm into every nerve I possessed. My mind whirled with possibilities. Was there an intruder behind the walls? An entity from somewhere else? Or was this just my psyche unraveling under stress? My mouth was dry as dust, and my skin felt feverish with cold perspiration. Each breath tasted like metal. With trembling steps, I approached the closet. The pounding stopped suddenly. My heart hammered so violently that I could feel the blood pulsating in my throat. My shaking hand reached for the closet knob. At that moment, something slammed against the inside panel. I jerked away, nearly falling over. Air refused to fill my lungs for several seconds. It felt like the entire apartment was vibrating with a presence I couldn't see. My vision blurred at the edges from pure terror, but somehow I forced my hand forward and flung the door open. Nothing, just empty space. The same stagnant air, the same old clothes hanging. Yet the tension in the atmosphere was thick enough to choke me. I collapsed to the floor, knees weak, heart still galloping. That was it. I couldn't endure another second of whatever shared these walls with me. My body shook with raw, uncontrollable fear. I could feel my sanity slipping, my thoughts unraveling into chaotic images of doorbells ringing in endless corridors and fists pounding from behind closet doors. Without allowing myself to hesitate, I threw some clothes into a bag, grabbed my keys, and stumbled into the hallway. The corridor felt impossibly long, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see that flicker of movement again. The air felt too thick, and my chest constricted in near panic. I had no plan, no clear destination in mind. I just needed to be anywhere else. Before I reached the elevator, the corridor light overhead blinked once, then again plunging everything into near darkness. My heart lurched. In the dimness, I almost heard a soft whisper, so faint I couldn't make out words if there were any at all. It might have been my imagination. My ears rang with the aftershocks of fear. The sound was like a sigh, as though the apartment was letting me go or mocking my departure. With adrenaline screaming in my veins, I jammed my finger into the elevator button. Seconds later, the old metal doors clattered open, and I stepped in, feeling a wave of nausea at the sudden motion downward. My heart pounded so fiercely that I could hardly believe it was still contained within my ribs. When I reached the lobby, the doorman was dozing off in his chair, oblivious to the turmoil coursing through me. For a fleeting moment, I considered explaining what was happening upstairs, but something stopped me. What could I say that wouldn't make me sound unhinged? The doorbell that rings without power, the closet that knocks back at me. I'd likely offer a confused frown or assume it was just insomnia. Instead, I rushed through the lobby, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. My hands trembled on the glass door leading outside, and I pushed it open with a mix of desperation and relief. On the street, the city lights felt harsh but comforting. Even the distant hum of traffic reassured me that normal life persisted out here, unaffected by the apartment's suffocating grip. My muscles gradually loosened, though the sense of being observed clung to me like a shadow. As I looked back at the building's facade, towering and regal against the night sky, I shivered. An irrational part of me wondered if the building itself was a living thing, exhaling ancient secrets through the cracks in its walls. My mind reeled with the question, had I escaped or had I simply dragged my fear with me? Even now, as I try to recollect those final moments, My chest tightens. There's a crawling dread that something from that apartment still lingers in my periphery, a presence that brushed against my life, leaving behind a stain of alarm and uncertainty. I have no intention of returning soon, yet I'm haunted by the thought that in abandoning the apartment I might have left something unresolved, some entity still waiting behind that closet door. In the back of my mind, I keep expecting the phone to ring or my new doorbell to sound in the dead of night, an echo of the terror I fled. No matter where I go, that sensation of being watched has never fully gone away. Even now, I occasionally jolt awake in the small hours. My heart hammers, convinced I've heard that unmistakable ding-dong once again. And in that moment, I'm back in that narrow corridor, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, swallowed by the shadows of an ancient place that refuses to let me forget.